In the Valley of the Kings, on the western bank of the Nile at ancient Thebes, there is a tomb numbered KV14. It is one of the largest tombs in the valley, a corridor stretching more than 100 meters into the limestone hillside. Its walls once covered with elaborate scenes from the underworld texts, its chambers once filled with the burial equipment of a ruler who intended to spend eternity among the greatest pharaohs Egypt had ever produced. The tomb was built for a woman who held every title that a male pharaoh held, a woman who wore the double crown, who carried the crook and flail, who was depicted smiting the enemies of Egypt in the traditional pose of kingship. Her throne name was Sitre-Meriamun, daughter of Ra, beloved of Amun. Her birth name was Tawosret, and within a generation of her death, almost every trace of her was deliberately destroyed. Her cartouches were chiseled from the tomb walls and replaced with those of the man who overthrew her dynasty. Her mortuary temple, the place where her cult was meant to be maintained for eternity, was dismantled and its stones reused in the construction of a rival king's monument. Her statues were recarved, her inscriptions overwritten, her name scratched from the king lists that recorded the official succession of Egyptian rulers. The erasure was systematic, thorough, and nearly total, if not for a handful of surviving objects, a few scarabs, a fragment of a stela in the Sinai, and the tomb itself, whose original decoration could not be entirely concealed beneath the later alterations. Tawosret might have been erased completely, a woman who ruled all of Egypt, who commanded armies and appointed priests, and made offerings to the gods, as the living representative of Horus on earth, reduced to a ghost. A name that survives only because the men who tried to erase it were not quite thorough enough. The numbers are striking. Tawosret ruled as sole pharaoh for approximately 2 years at the very end of the 19th dynasty, roughly 1189 to 1187 BC, according to most current chronological estimates. Before that, she served as regent for a boy king named Siptah, guiding the affairs of state for approximately 6 years, while the young pharaoh grew into a reign he would never fully control. In total, she was the most powerful person in Egypt for the better part of a decade. And yet, for most of the 3,000 years between her death and the modern era, she was unknown. Not forgotten in the way that minor officials are forgotten, their names simply fading from memory as generations pass, forgotten deliberately, purposefully, by people who wanted the world to believe she had never existed. But here is the problem. You cannot erase a pharaoh, not completely, not when they carved their name into the living rock of the Valley of the Kings, not when they stamped their cartouche onto scarabs that were scattered across the eastern desert and the turquoise mines of the Sinai, not when their existence is woven into the diplomatic and administrative fabric of an empire that kept records on stone and clay as well as on perishable papyrus. The erasure of Tawosret was thorough, but it was not total, and in the gaps between the chisel marks, in the shadows beneath the overcut inscriptions, in the fragments that survived, because they were too small or too remote to attract the attention of the destroyers, her story has been slowly, painstakingly reconstructed by archaeologists who understand that the absence of evidence is not the same as the evidence of absence. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand how a woman seized the throne of the most powerful civilization on Earth, how she held it against forces that would have destroyed lesser rulers, and how, in the end, she was betrayed not by her enemies on the battlefield, but by the men who came after her, and decided that a woman on the throne of Egypt was a story that should never have been told. This is the story of the last queen who became king, the last female pharaoh of a dynasty that had begun in military glory and ended in political chaos, the last woman to wear the double crown before Cleopatra, and unlike Cleopatra, a woman whose name most people have never heard. There is something especially haunting about a ruler whose very existence was contested. We are accustomed to the idea that history forgets, that names fade, that monuments crumble, that the passage of centuries reduces even the greatest achievements to dust. But Tawosret was not forgotten by accident. She was forgotten on purpose. Every chisel mark on the walls of her tomb, every recarved cartouche, every stone block flipped face down in the foundations of a rival's temple, is evidence of a deliberate campaign to make the world believe that a woman never ruled Egypt at the end of the 19th dynasty. The silence that surrounds her is not the silence of neglect, it is the silence of intention. And breaking that silence, reconstructing the life of a woman whom powerful men try to unmake, is one of the most achievements of modern Egyptology. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Tawosret, you must first understand the world she inherited, a world that was already cracking at the foundations when she was born. The 19th dynasty of Egypt is one of the most celebrated in all of pharaonic history. It was founded by a military strongman named Ramesses I, who came to power around 1295 BC after the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, the elderly Horemheb, died without an heir. Ramesses I was himself an old man when he took the throne, and his reign lasted barely 2 years. But his son, Seti I, proved to be a vigorous and capable ruler who restored Egyptian military prestige across the Levant and initiated a building program of extraordinary ambition. And Seti's son, Ramesses II the Great, became the most famous pharaoh in Egyptian history, ruling for 67 years, fighting the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, signing the world's first known peace treaty, and covering the length and breadth of Egypt with monuments bearing his name and image. The 19th dynasty, in its first 3 generations, represented the pinnacle of New Kingdom power. Egypt was wealthy, militarily dominant, diplomatically connected, and culturally productive on a scale that would not be matched again for centuries. But dynasties, like bridges, can look solid even when the supports are failing, and the supports of the 19th dynasty began to fail almost as soon as Ramesses II died. Ramesses lived for more than 90 years. He outlived at least 12 of his sons, who had been designated as crown prince in succession. When he finally died, around 1213 BC, the throne passed to Meremptah, his 13th son, already an old man himself. Meremptah's reign lasted roughly 10 years, and was marked by military campaigns against Libyan invaders and the mysterious sea peoples, groups of migrants or raiders from the Mediterranean who were pressing against Egypt's northern borders with increasing intensity. Meremptah handled these threats competently, but his death around 1203 BC opened a wound in the dynasty that would never fully heal. The problem was succession. Meremptah's designated heir, Seti II, did not immediately secure the throne. A rival claimant named Amenmès, whose exact relationship to the royal family remains debated by scholars, seized control of Upper Egypt and may have ruled simultaneously with Seti II for several years. The details of this conflict are murky, pieced together from fragmentary inscriptions, altered cartouches, and the physical evidence of monuments that were built, defaced, and rebuilt in rapid succession. What is clear is that by the time Seti II finally consolidated his hold on the entire country, the 19th dynasty had suffered a crisis of legitimacy from which it would never fully recover. This is the world into which Tawosret enters the historical record. She appears as the great royal wife of Seti II, his principal queen, the woman who stood beside him at state ceremonies, who held the sacred titles that connected the queen to the goddesses Isis, Hathor, and Mut. Her origins before her marriage are uncertain. Some scholars have suggested that she may have been of royal blood, perhaps a daughter of Meremptah or even a granddaughter of Ramesses II. But no definitive genealogical evidence has been found. Others have proposed that she was a member of the high nobility, elevated to queenship through marriage rather than birth. The silence of the sources on this point is itself telling. In a culture that obsessively recorded lineage and divine parentage, the absence of any clear statement about Tawosret's origins suggests either that her background was too obscure to trumpet, or that the records that once existed were destroyed in the general erasure that followed her reign. What we do know is that Seti II's reign was troubled. The aftermath of the Amenmès conflict had left the administration fractured and the treasury depleted. The Eastern Mediterranean was in turmoil. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's former rival and eventual treaty partner, was itself under pressure from the Sea Peoples and internal instability. The trade networks that had sustained Egypt's wealth for centuries were beginning to fray. Seti II ruled for approximately 6 years, and during that time he undertook building projects at Karnak, at Hermopolis, and in the Valley of the Kings, where he began construction of his own tomb, KV-15, but the scale of his monuments was modest compared to those of his predecessors. The resources were not what they had been. The revenues were declining, the borders were uncertain, and the empire was visibly contracting. And then Seti II died. The circumstances of his death are unclear. There is no surviving record of illness, no funeral inscription that survives in complete form, no indication of whether his end was sudden or prolonged, peaceful or violent. What is clear is that his death created a succession crisis of the First Order. The legitimate heir, if one had been formally designated, is not known with certainty. What happened next was the elevation of a boy named Siptah to the throne of Egypt, a boy who was probably in his early teens, who may have suffered from a physical disability affecting his left foot, and whose claim to the throne was, at best, contested. Siptah's parentage is one of the most debated questions in late 19th dynasty studies. His mother may have been a secondary wife of Seti II, or he may have been the son of Amenmès, the very rival whose rebellion had destabilized the dynasty. If the latter is true, then the boy who sat on the throne of Egypt was the son of a usurper, placed there not by the logic of dynastic succession, but by the political maneuvering of the people who actually controlled the court. And the two people who controlled the court were Tawosret and a man named Bey. Bey is one of the most extraordinary figures in late New Kingdom history. He held the title of Chancellor of the entire land, the highest administrative office in the Egyptian state below the Pharaoh. He was, by all available evidence, of foreign origin, possibly Syrian or Canaanite, which made his rise to the pinnacle of Egyptian government all the more remarkable in a culture that generally viewed foreigners with suspicion. The Egyptian term used to describe his origin, Karu, referring to the Syro-Palestinian region, appears in some sources alongside his name, a marker that would have been unnecessary if his foreignness were not noteworthy. In a court that traced its legitimacy through royal blood and divine descent, Bey stood out as a man whose power derived not from lineage, but from capability, from his ability to manage the machinery of state at a moment when the royal family itself could not. Bey's power during Siptah's reign was immense. He is described in one inscription as the man who established the king on the throne of his father, a phrase that implies not merely administrative support, but active king-making. The audacity of this claim is difficult to overstate. No non-royal official in Egyptian history had ever publicly taken credit for placing a king on the throne. The claim positioned Bey not as a servant of the monarchy, but as a maker of monarchs, a figure whose authority rivaled, and perhaps in practical terms exceeded, that of the pharaoh himself. He was granted the extraordinary privilege of constructing his own tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV-13, a privilege that was, in theory, reserved exclusively for members of the royal family. The tomb is small by royal standards, but its location in the most sacred burial ground in Egypt speaks to a level of influence that was virtually unprecedented for a commoner, let alone a foreigner. Bey chose Siptah. Bey put him on the throne. And for the first years of Siptah's reign, Bey and Tawosret together governed Egypt, while the boy king served as a figurative head of state. The arrangement was unprecedented. A foreign-born chancellor and a queen regent jointly managing the affairs of the most powerful state in the ancient world. The potential for conflict was enormous, and eventually conflict came. But for several years, the partnership held. Tawosret appears in inscriptions alongside Siptah, her titles expanding as her authority grew. She is depicted in temple reliefs making offerings to the gods, a role traditionally reserved for the king. She oversaw the construction of her own tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a privilege granted to no queen since Hatshepsut, and the scale and ambition of the tomb's decoration make clear that she was not merely a regent waiting for a boy to grow up. She was building a legacy. She was preparing for something. The relationship between Tawosret and Bey during these years is one of the most intriguing political partnerships in ancient Egyptian history. Both were, in different ways, outsiders, Tawosret because of her sex, Bey because of his foreign birth. Both held power that was technically derived from the young king, but was, in practice, exercised independently, and both had reason to be wary of the other. Bey's position depended on his role as kingmaker, the man who had placed Siptah on the throne and who could presumably be blamed if the arrangement failed. Tawosret's position depended on her role as the senior royal, the great royal wife, whose connection to the legitimate dynasty gave the entire government whatever shred of dynastic credibility it possessed. They needed each other, and they must have known, even as they governed together, that the need was temporary, that eventually one would have to yield to the other. The question was who would yield first, and whether the yielding would be voluntary. The evidence from Deir el-Medina provides a remarkably granular view of life under this dual government. The Ostraka record not only work schedules and supply deliveries, but also the regnal dates by which events were calculated. And these dates show that for the first years of Siptah's reign, the government functioned with reasonable efficiency. The workers received their rations. The tomb construction proceeded on schedule. The festivals were observed. The ordinary machinery of the Egyptian state continued to turn, even as the people at the top of that machinery were engaged in a power struggle whose resolution was far from certain. The villagers of Deir el-Medina probably understood very little of the court politics that shaped their lives. They knew who paid them. They knew when the payments were late, and they kept records that 3,000 years later would prove essential to reconstructing the chronology of a reign that the official sources tried to erase. Siptah himself remains a shadowy figure despite holding the throne for 6 years. His mummy was identified in the KV-35 cache, and the examination revealed a man who had died young, probably around 20 years of age, with a deformed left foot that appears to have been the result of a childhood illness, possibly polio. The deformity would have been visible, would have required Siptah to walk with a noticeable limp, and would have raised questions in a culture that placed enormous emphasis on the physical perfection of the divine king. A pharaoh with a clubfoot was a pharaoh whose body did not conform to the ideal of Horus, the falcon god whose earthly representative was supposed to embody strength, vitality, and physical wholeness. Whether Siptah's disability affected his ability to govern or merely provided his enemies with a convenient target for delegitimization is impossible to determine from the available evidence. But the existence of the disability adds another layer of vulnerability to a reign that was already precarious on every other front. The archaeology tells the story that the inscriptions only hint at. Tawosret's tomb, KV-14, was begun during Seti II's reign as a queen's tomb, modest in scope, appropriate for a great royal wife. But during Siptah's reign, the tomb was dramatically expanded. The corridors were lengthened. New chambers were excavated. The decorative program was upgraded from the simpler style appropriate to a queen to the full repertoire of royal underworld texts. The Litany of Ra, the Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates that were reserved for pharaohs. The transformation of the tomb is physical evidence of the transformation of Tawosret's ambitions. She was not content to remain a regent. She was not content to exercise power behind the scenes, while a sickly boy wore the crown. She was preparing to become pharaoh herself. And then, in the 5th or 6th year of Siptah's reign, something happened to Bey. The details are fragmentary, but a remarkable ostrakon, a limestone flake used for informal writing, was discovered at Deir el-Medina, the village of the royal tomb builders, and it records a chilling statement. The text announces that Pharaoh has killed the great enemy Bey, using the word for enemy that the Egyptians reserved for the most dangerous threats to the state. The man who had placed Siptah on the throne, who had governed alongside Tawosret for years, was executed. The reasons are not stated. Treason, a power struggle with Tawosret, an attempt to seize the throne for himself. The ostrakon does not explain. It merely records the fact, with the bureaucratic precision that characterized Egyptian administration, even in moments of political upheaval, that the most powerful non-royal official in Egypt had been killed on the pharaoh's orders. But whose orders? Siptah was still a teenager at the time of Bey's execution. The real power behind the throne was Tawosret, The question of whether it was Tawosret who ordered Bey's death, whether the queen regent eliminated a rival who had grown too powerful or too ambitious, is one that scholars have debated for decades. The evidence is insufficient to reach a definitive conclusion, but the timing is suggestive. Bey's elimination removed the last obstacle between Tawosret and sole control of the Egyptian state, and within a year or two of Bey's death, Siptah himself was dead, dying at approximately 20 years of age, his mummy showing evidence of the clubfoot that had likely afflicted him since birth. His reign ending not with a transition to a designated heir, but with a vacuum that Tawosret moved swiftly to fill. She declared herself Pharaoh, not regent, not queen, Pharaoh. The word itself, per-ar, meaning great house, had evolved over centuries from a term describing the royal palace to a title describing the person who inhabited it. To claim that title was to claim identity with the institution itself, to become, in the eyes of theology and law, the living embodiment of the Egyptian state. Tawosret took this step with full awareness of what it meant and what it would cost. She adopted the full five-fold titulary of an Egyptian king. She took the throne name Sitra-May-Amun, daughter of Ra, beloved of Amun. She was depicted in the traditional male pose of kingship, striding forward, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, holding the crook and flail. Her tomb was expanded once again to reflect her new status, and her cartouches were inscribed alongside those of Seti II in a symbolic marriage of her reign to the legitimacy of the dynasty's last undisputed male ruler. She did what only one woman before her, Hatshepsut, had done in the entire history of pharaonic Egypt. She claimed the identity of a living god. The parallels with Hatshepsut are striking, but the differences are equally important. Hatshepsut had taken power during a period of relative stability, building on the foundation of a strong dynasty with a clear line of succession. Tawosret seized power during a period of acute crisis, in a dynasty that was already tearing itself apart. Hatshepsut had ruled for more than 20 years, long enough to build magnificent monuments and establish a prosperous reign that would be remembered, even if later kings tried to erase her. Tawosret had perhaps 2 years. 2 years to consolidate her authority, to manage the declining economy, to defend against external threats, to establish her legitimacy in the eyes of a court and a priesthood that had just witnessed the execution of a chancellor and the death of a boy king under circumstances that were, at best, suspicious. 2 years, that was all she had, and it was not enough. But before we reach the catastrophe, we need to understand the stage on which it played out. The physical, administrative, and theological infrastructure of the late 19th dynasty state that Tawosret was trying to hold together. The capital of Egypt during the Ramesside period was Pi-Ramesses, the massive city that Ramesses II had built in the eastern delta near the site of the old Hyksos capital of Avaris. At its peak, Pi-Ramesses covered an area of roughly 30 square kilometers and housed a population estimated at 200,000 to 300,000 people. It was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, a center of administration, military planning, diplomatic correspondence, and monumental architecture. The palace complex was enormous, surrounded by workshops, barracks, stables for chariot horses, and the offices of the vast bureaucracy that managed the Egyptian empire. From Pi-Ramesses, the pharaoh's commands radiated outward to the provincial governors, the temple administrators, the military commanders, and the border garrisons that maintained Egypt's presence from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the Euphrates. But Pi-Ramesses was a northern capital, and Egypt's religious heart remained in the south, at Thebes, where the great temple complex of Karnak served as the earthly dwelling of Amun-Ra, king of the gods. The tension between the political capital in the north and the religious capital in the south was a constant feature of Ramesside governance, requiring the pharaoh to maintain legitimacy in both spheres simultaneously. Control of the Amun priesthood at Karnak was essential to any ruler's claim to divine approval. The high priest of Amun was one of the most powerful individuals in Egypt, commander of temple estates that encompassed vast tracts of agricultural land, herds of cattle numbering in the tens of thousands, and a workforce of laborers, craftsmen, and scribes who operated as a virtual state within the state. To lose the support of the Amun priesthood was to lose the theological foundation on which all Egyptian kingship rested. Tawosret, as regent and then as pharaoh, had to navigate both spheres. She had to maintain the administrative machinery of Pi-Ramesses, while also securing the loyalty of the southern religious establishment. The evidence suggests that she attempted to do both. Her building activities at Karnak, though modest, indicate an effort to maintain her presence at the Temple of Amun, while the administrative records from the Deir el-Medina community suggest that the government continued to function under her authority, at least for a time. But governing from two centers of power, with limited resources and a contested claim to the throne, was a challenge that would have taxed a ruler with far more experience and far more time than Tawosret possessed. The physical landscape of power in late New Kingdom Egypt is essential to understanding why Tawosret's position was so precarious. The Valley of the Kings, where she was building her tomb, was a narrow wadi on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, a desolate canyon of white limestone cliffs, baking under the Egyptian sun, accessible only through narrow passes that were guarded by a police force known as the Medjay. The tombs cut into its walls represented the ultimate expression of royal authority. The pharaohs claimed to a place among the gods in the afterlife. To build a tomb in the Valley of the Kings was to declare oneself pharaoh in the most concrete and permanent way possible. The stone itself was the medium of legitimacy, and Tawosret's decision to expand her tomb from a queen's burial to a king's monument, to deepen the corridors, to widen the chambers, to commission the full repertoire of royal underworld texts, was the physical manifestation of her political transformation. The craftsmen who carried out this work were the same community that had built the tombs of every pharaoh since the early 18th dynasty, the villagers of Deir el-Medina. This community of roughly 60 families lived in a walled settlement on the west bank of Thebes, separated from the general population by both geography and social status. They were state employees, paid in grain, oil, fish, vegetables, and occasionally silver or other goods, and their work was considered so sensitive that they were, in effect, a closed community. Their daily lives are documented in extraordinary detail thanks to the thousands of ostraka and papyri that have been recovered from the village and its surroundings. Records of work schedules, supply deliveries, legal disputes, personal letters, even love poems and jokes. From these records, we know that the workers were organized into two gangs, the right side and the left side, corresponding to the two walls of the tomb corridor, each led by a foreman and supervised by scribes who kept meticulous records of attendance, absences, and the progress of the work. During the reigns of Siptah and Tawosret, the Deir el-Medina records reveal a community under increasing strain. Supply deliveries were becoming irregular. The rations of grain that constituted the workers' primary payment were sometimes late, sometimes reduced in quantity. The workers complained, and their complaints were recorded on the ostraka that served as the community's informal archive. These are not the complaints of people on the verge of revolt, not yet, but they are the complaints of people who sense that something is wrong with the system that sustains them, that the state is no longer functioning as reliably as it once did, that the granaries are not as full as they should be, that the promises made by the administration are not being kept. The workers continued to build. They continued to carve and paint the tombs of the Valley of the Kings with the same skill and dedication that had characterized their community for generations. But the confidence was eroding. The social contract between the pharaoh and the craftsman, the understanding that the state would provide for those who served it, was fraying, and Tawosret, whether she knew it or not, was the last pharaoh for whom this particular community would work with something approaching confidence in the future. The great labour strike that would rock Deir el-Medina, the first recorded strike in human history, in which the workers walked off the job and marched to the mortuary temples to demand their unpaid wages, would come in the reign of Ramesses III, the grandson of the man who would overthrow Tawosret. But the conditions that made that strike possible were already taking shape during her reign. The roots of the crisis ran deep, and they were growing deeper. the international context was equally unstable. The late 13th and early 12th centuries BC were the period that modern historians call the Bronze Age collapse, a systemic crisis that would, within a few generations, destroy nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire was already under severe pressure from population movements, drought, and internal political fragmentation. The Mycenaean palatial centres in Greece were approaching their final destruction. The trading cities of the Levantine coast, Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, were experiencing disruptions to the maritime trade networks that had sustained their wealth for centuries. The Sea Peoples, a coalition of migrant and raiding groups whose exact origins remain one of the great unsolved problems of ancient history, were pressing against the borders of Egypt, Libya, and Anatolia with increasing frequency and intensity. Tawosret's Egypt existed at the edge of this gathering storm. The storm would not break in full force until the reign of Ramesses III, roughly a decade after Tawosret's fall, when the Sea Peoples launched a massive coordinated assault on the Egyptian delta that Ramesses barely managed to repel. But the pressures that would produce that crisis were already building during Tawosret's time. The trade routes were less reliable, the diplomatic networks were less functional. The supply of tin, essential for the production of bronze, the metal on which the entire military and economic system depended, was becoming harder to secure. The world that had sustained Egypt's prosperity for centuries was coming apart, and the rulers of the late 19th dynasty were trying to govern an empire whose supports were crumbling beneath them. This was the world in which Tawosret declared herself pharaoh, not a world of abundance and stability, where a bold claim to the throne could be backed by military success and economic generosity, a world of scarcity and uncertainty, where every claim to legitimacy was contested, where every allocation of resources was a political decision with winners and losers, where the margin between survival and collapse was narrowing with each passing year. The last female pharaoh of the 19th dynasty did not inherit a kingdom. She inherited a crisis, and the crisis, in the end, consumed her. The core problem of Tawosret's story is not simply that she was of a woman who became pharaoh. The core problem is that she became pharaoh at the worst possible moment, at the terminal crisis point of a dynasty that had been dying for a generation, and that the very act of taking the throne may have accelerated the collapse she was trying to prevent. To understand this, we need to look at the 19th dynasty as a whole and see the pattern that was already in motion long before Tawosret ever sat on the throne of Egypt. The dynasty had been built on military strength. Ramesses I was a soldier. Seti I was a warrior king who campaigned across the Levant and restored Egyptian control over territories that had been lost during the Amarna period. Ramesses II fought the largest chariot battle in history at Kadesh and spent decades maintaining Egypt's military presence in Syria and Palestine. The legitimacy of the 19th dynasty was rooted in martial prowess, in the ability of its kings to defend the borders of Egypt and project power beyond them. When that military energy began to dissipate, when the later kings of the dynasty no longer had the resources or the will to campaign abroad, the dynasty's foundational claim to authority began to erode. Meremptah had managed to maintain the military tradition, defeating the Libyans and the Sea Peoples in campaigns that are recorded on his famous Israel Stela, the earliest known Egyptian reference to Israel as an entity. But Meremptah was already old when he took the throne, and his victories were defensive rather than expansive. He was holding the line, not advancing it. After his death, the dynasty's military coherence dissolved. The Amenmesse rebellion divided the country. Seti II reunified it, but at a cost that left the treasury depleted and the administration weakened. By the time Siptah and Tawosret were governing Egypt, the empire was a shadow of what it had been under Ramesses the Great. The Levantine provinces were slipping away. The Nubian territories were increasingly difficult to control. The Sea Peoples were pressing against the delta, and the domestic economy, dependent on agricultural surpluses, trade revenues, and the efficient distribution of resources through the temple and palace systems, was under severe strain. This was the Egypt that Tawosret inherited, not the Egypt of colossal statues and golden treasures and diplomatic correspondence with the great kings of the ancient world. The Egypt of empty granaries and unpaid workers and uncertain borders. The Egypt where the royal tomb builders at Deir el-Medina, the very men who carved and painted the tombs of the pharaohs, had begun to complain about late payments and reduced rations, complaints that are documented in the surviving papyri and ostraca from the village, and that would, in the following dynasty, escalate into the first recorded labor strike in human history. And it gets worse, because the political situation inside the court was even more dangerous than the economic situation outside it. Tawosret's claim to the throne was, by the standards of Egyptian royal ideology, deeply problematic. She was not a king's son. She was a king's wife, and a wife of a king whose own legitimacy had been challenged by the Amenmès rebellion. Her path to power ran through a regency for a boy king of dubious parentage, a co-governance with a foreign-born chancellor who had been executed as an enemy of the state, and the suspicious death of the young pharaoh she was supposed to be protecting. Every step on Tawosret's path to the throne could be, and was, reinterpreted by her enemies as evidence of conspiracy, of illegitimacy, of a woman who had manipulated her way to power through means that violated the sacred order of Egyptian kingship. The sacred order was clear. Egypt was ruled by a male king who was the living incarnation of Horus, the falcon god. When the king died, he became Osiris, the ruler of the underworld, and his son, the new Horus, took his place on the throne. The cycle of Horus and Osiris, of father and son, of death and renewal, was the theological engine of Egyptian monarchy. A woman could not be Horus. A woman could not be the son of Osiris. A woman on the throne disrupted the most fundamental cosmological narrative that Egyptian civilization possessed. The religious texts were explicit on this point. The pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead all assumed a male king as the central figure in the cosmic drama of death and rebirth. A female pharaoh required a rewriting of the theological script, and rewriting theology is dangerous in any culture, but especially dangerous in one where the stability of the universe was believed to depend on the correct performance of ritual by the correct person in the correct role. Hatshepsut had solved this problem through sheer force of will and creative theology. She had herself depicted as male in statuary and reliefs. She invented the narrative of a divine birth in which Amun himself chose her to rule. She appointed powerful allies to key positions, men like Senenmut, her steward and architect, who ensured that the administration remained loyal to her. And she had time, 20 years of prosperous, stable rule that made it difficult for anyone to argue that her reign was anything other than a success. 20 years in which to build Deir el-Bahari, to send expeditions to Punt, to erect obelisks at Karnak, to weave her presence so deeply into the fabric of the state that erasing her would require a generation-long campaign of systematic destruction. Tawosret had none of these advantages. She had no time, she had no prosperity, she had no powerful ally to replace the executed Bey. She had a court that was fractured by years of succession disputes, a military that was overstretched and under-equipped, an economy that was contracting, and a theological framework that was structurally hostile to her very existence as pharaoh. She was trying to do what Hatshepsut had done, but in a fraction of the time, with a fraction of the resources, and against far greater opposition. The comparison between the two female pharaohs is instructive in another way. Hatshepsut's erasure, when it came, was selective. Thutmose III did not attempt to destroy every trace of her existence. He focused on her images as pharaoh, on the statuary and reliefs that showed her in the regalia of kingship. Her name as great royal wife was generally left intact. The distinction suggests that the problem was not that Hatshepsut had existed, but that she had ruled. The erasure was aimed at the precedent, not the person, and it was carried out roughly 20 years after her death, by which time Thutmose III was secure enough on his own throne that the erasure served more as a statement of ideological principle than as a political necessity. Tawosret's erasure was different in character. It was immediate, carried out by the very man who replaced her, while the memory of her reign was still raw. It was comprehensive, targeting not only her images as pharaoh but her tomb, her temple, her administrative records, her place in the official king lists, and it was existential, aimed not merely at the precedent but at the person. Setnake did not just want to prevent future women from following Tawosret's example, he wanted to remove her from history entirely. The difference in scope suggests a difference in motivation. Hatshepsut was erased to correct a theological anomaly. Tawosret was erased to legitimize a coup, because Setnakut's claim to the throne was itself problematic. His origins are obscure, possibly a minor member of the Ramesside family, possibly a military commander who rose to power through force rather than heredity. His legitimacy depended on the narrative that the 19th dynasty had ended in chaos, and that he, Setnakut, had been chosen by the gods to restore order. That narrative required Tawosret to be illegitimate, required her reign to be recast as an aberration, a period of misrule and disorder that justified the violent transfer of power that had brought Setnakhet to the throne. If Tawosret were remembered as a legitimate pharaoh, as a woman who had governed competently during a difficult period, and whose reign was a logical continuation of the 19th dynasty's succession, then Setnakhet's claim to divine selection would be undermined. He was not a restorer of order if the order had never been broken. He was a usurper, and usurpers cannot afford to leave the memories of their predecessors intact. The physical evidence of her reign is, accordingly, sparse. Her building projects were modest. Some construction at the Temple of Amun at Karnak, where her cartouches can still be identified on certain blocks. A small temple in the Sinai at Timna, near the copper and turquoise mines that were vital to Egypt's economy. Her mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes, the mansion of millions of years, where her funerary cult was to be maintained, was constructed, but its stones were later entirely usurped by her successor. The fragments that remain suggest a temple of standard royal design, but not on the scale of Hatshepsut's magnificent terrace structure at Deir el-Bahari or Ramesses II's vast Ramesseum. Tawosret was building for legitimacy, not for grandeur. Every stone she laid was a statement that she belonged, that she was pharaoh, that the gods had chosen her. But the gods, or at least the men who claimed to speak for them, had other ideas. The end came swiftly. A man named Setnakhet, whose origins are as obscure as Tawosret's own, rose against her and seized the throne. Setnakhet claimed to be the founder of a new dynasty, the 20th, and his rhetoric was explicitly framed as the restoration of order after a period of chaos and illegitimacy. His inscriptions describe the years immediately preceding his reign in terms that echo the mythological language of the first intermediate period, a time of disorder, of foreigners in positions of power, of social inversion, of the collapse of proper government. The language is formulaic, drawing on centuries of Egyptian literary tradition for describing periods of crisis. But the target is clear. Setnakhet was describing the reigns of Siptah and Tawosret, and particularly the role of the foreign chancellor Bey as an abomination, a deviation from the proper order that the gods demanded, a cancer that had to be cut out so that Egypt could be reborn. Whether Tawosret was killed, deposed, or simply died at an inopportune moment is unknown. The transition from Tawosret to Setnakhet is one of the most poorly documented political transitions in all of pharaonic history. Some scholars believe that there may have been a brief period of civil conflict. Others suggest that Tawosret may have died of natural causes, and that Setnakhet simply stepped into the vacuum, claiming legitimacy by default in the absence of any clear alternative. A third hypothesis proposes that Setnakhet was a member of the broader Ramessid family, perhaps a grandson of Ramesses II through a minor line, who reasserted the dynasty's claim to the throne by overthrowing a woman who, in his view, had no right to hold it. The most important textual evidence for this transition is the Elephantine Stela of Setnakhet, a monument erected at the southern border of Egypt that provides Setnakhet's own account, or rather, his propaganda version, of how he came to power. The text is damaged and difficult to interpret, but the surviving portions describe a period of chaos in which foreigners had infiltrated the Egyptian government, in which the treasury had been looted, and in which the proper order of governance had broken down. Setnak presents himself as the chosen instrument of divine restoration, a man selected by the gods, specifically by Seth, the god of storms and chaos, who was paradoxically also the patron deity of the Ramesside dynasty, to set things right. The language is formulaic, drawing heavily on established literary conventions for describing periods of disorder, but the political message is unmistakable. The previous regime was illegitimate. The previous rulers were usurpers or pawns of foreign influence, and Setnakht, by divine mandate, has swept them away and restored the proper order. The reference to foreigners in positions of power is almost certainly an allusion to Bey, the Syrian-born chancellor who had governed alongside Tawosret and who had already been executed by the time Setnakhe came to power. By invoking Bey's foreignness and casting it as a symptom of national disorder, Setnakate was able to delegitimize the entire preceding period, to paint the reigns of Siptah and Tawosret as a single, continuous aberration characterized by alien influence and the breakdown of sacred norms. The fact that Bey had been dead for years by the time Setnakhe wrote his stela did not matter. What mattered was the narrative, the story that justified the new king's claim to the throne, and that story required villains. Bey was the foreign villain. Tawosret was the female villain. Together, they represented everything that had gone wrong with Egypt, everything that Setnakhe had been divinely appointed to correct. The Elephantine Stela is propaganda, not history, but it is extraordinarily effective propaganda, effective enough to have shaped the way Tawosret was perceived for 3,000 years, until modern Egyptologists began to question the 20th dynasty's narrative. Tawosret was understood, to the extent that she was understood at all, as a figure of disorder, a symbol of dynastic decline, a woman who had overstepped her bounds and brought ruin upon the state. The stela's version of events became the default version, the truth, that Tawosret had governed competently during an impossible situation, that her assumption of the throne was a rational response to a genuine crisis, that her brief reign was no more disordered than those of several male pharaohs who were never erased, was buried beneath the weight of the victor's narrative. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The destruction that followed was not random, it was targeted, systematic, designed not merely to transfer power from one ruler to another, but to erase the memory of a specific person from the record of Egyptian history. Setnakhe took Tawosret's tomb, KV-14, the tomb she had expanded from a queen's burial into a pharaoh's monument over the course of more than a decade, and he claimed it as his own. His burial was placed in the innermost chambers, and his cartouches were carved over hers on the walls. Tawosret's image, which had been painstakingly painted and carved into the limestone, was in many places hacked away and replaced with representations of the new king. The theological program of the tomb, the underworld texts that were meant to guide Tawosret's soul through the dangers of the afterlife, was altered to serve Setnakhet's journey instead. The queen's passage to eternity was literally overwritten by the man who had taken her throne. The mortuary temple suffered the same fate. Setnakhet's son, Ramesses III, who would become the last great warrior pharaoh of the new kingdom, dismantled Tawosret's temple and reused its stones in his own massive mortuary complex at Medinet Habu. The blocks were turned and recut, their original inscriptions facing inward or downward, hidden from view. But stone remembers what chisels try to make it forget. When archaeologists examined the foundations and walls of Medinet Habu, they found blocks bearing Tawosret's cartouches built into the structure, proof that Ramesses III had literally consumed his predecessor's monument to feed his own. The pattern extends beyond the major monuments. Tawosret's name was removed from the official king lists, the documents that recorded the succession of legitimate pharaohs in temple inscriptions and papyrus archives, the Abydos king list, the Saqqara tablet, the Tyrin Canaan, the major sources that later Egyptians and modern historians used to reconstruct the sequence of Egyptian rulers. Either omit Tawosret entirely or record her reign in terms so ambiguous that scholars have spent decades debating what the entries mean. The Turin Canon, a papyrus document from the Ramesside period, that is the most complete ancient Egyptian king list to survive, is damaged at precisely the point where Tawosret's name should appear. Whether this damage is accidental or deliberate has been debated. The surviving fragments suggest that a reign of approximately the right length was recorded at the end of the 19th dynasty, but the name is lost. Some scholars have argued that the Turin canon originally included Tawosret and that the name was subsequently erased, or that the damage to the papyrus at this point is not coincidental. Others believe the damage is simply the result of the papyrus's poor state of preservation. The ambiguity is itself a form of erasure. Even the evidence for Tawosret's inclusion in the historical record is uncertain. The message was unambiguous. In the official version of Egyptian history, as constructed by the 20th dynasty, Tawosret was not a pharaoh. She was a disruption, an error, a brief and regrettable deviation from the proper order of things, best forgotten and never repeated. The erasure worked, almost. For more than 3,000 years, Tawosret was effectively unknown. She does not appear in the classical accounts of Egyptian history compiled by Greek and Roman writers. Manetho, the Egyptian priest who wrote a history of Egypt in Greek during the 3rd century BC, dividing the pharaohs into the dynasty system that scholars still use today, records a figure at the end of the 19th dynasty who may correspond to Tawosret, but the identification is uncertain, and the passage is corrupt. The name he uses, possibly Thuoris or a similar rendering, was long considered a male king. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that Egyptologists began to piece together the evidence and identify Tawosret as a woman who had ruled Egypt as pharaoh. The confusion in the classical sources is itself a testament to the thoroughness of the erasure. Manetho was writing more than 800 years after Tawosret's death, and he was working from Egyptian sources that had themselves been shaped by the 20th dynasty's propaganda. If the temple records omitted Tawosret, if the king lists excluded her or rendered her name ambiguously, then Manetho had no way of knowing that the figure at the end of the 19th dynasty was a woman. The distortion passed from the ancient sources to the classical intermediaries to the modern historians who used Manetho as a primary reference, a chain of misinformation stretching across 23 centuries, each link reinforcing the one before it, until the truth was buried beneath so many layers of repetition that it appeared to be the truth itself. The reconstruction was painstaking. It relied on the physical evidence of the tomb, where traces of Tawosret's original decoration could be detected beneath the later overlay. It relied on the scattered objects, scarabs, seals, inscribed fragments, that bore her name in contexts where the later erasure had not reached. It relied on the Deir el-Medina records, the bureaucratic archives of the tomb builder's village, which preserved dates and references that could be cross-referenced with the regnal years of Siptah and Tawosret. And it relied on a willingness by modern scholars to look past the 20th dynasty's propaganda and ask a simple question. What if the official version was a lie? The answer, as it emerged over decades of careful scholarship, was that the official version was indeed a lie, or at least a deliberate distortion. Tawosret had ruled. She had been pharaoh. She had held the full titulary, built a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and exercised the powers of the Egyptian state for a period that, while brief, was no shorter than the reigns of several male pharaohs who were never erased. The crime was not that she had ruled badly. The crime was that she had ruled at all, and the punishment was the most severe that Egyptian civilization could impose. Not execution, not exile, but something far worse: the deletion of her name, the destruction of her image, the removal of her existence from the official record of Egyptian history. In a culture that believed the survival of the name was essential to the survival of the soul, the erasure of Tawosret was not merely a political act. It was a spiritual assassination, an attempt to kill her not only in this world but in the next. Something is wrong with our assumptions when a civilization that built the pyramids, that produced some of the most sophisticated art and theology in human history, that governed millions of people for 3,000 years, could not tolerate a woman on the throne for more than 2 years without responding with systematic obliteration. The erasure of Tawosret was not an aberration, it was a feature of the system. The same system that erased Hatshepsut, though less completely, because Hatshepsut had 20 years to entrench her legacy before the erasers arrived. The same system that constrained Nefertiti and Nefertari and every other powerful woman who navigated the structures of Egyptian royal authority. The system allowed women to wield power. It did not allow them to be remembered for it. The archaeology of the Eurasia tells its own story, a story that is in many ways as compelling as the story of Tawosret's reign itself. Consider the tomb. KV-14 was first entered by modern explorers in the early 19th century, when the Valley of the Kings was being systematically investigated by European travellers and antiquarians. The tomb was initially attributed to Setnakhe, whose cartouches dominated the visible wall surfaces. It was not until careful examination of the underlying decoration revealed earlier layers of inscription, layers that had been partially but not completely erased, that the tomb's more complex history began to emerge. The German Egyptologist Hartwig Altenmüller conducted extensive work in KV-14 and published detailed studies of the tomb's stratigraphy, the layers of decoration, plaster, and inscription that tell the story of its transformation from queen's tomb to Pharaoh's tomb to usurped burial. Altenmüller's work revealed that the tomb had undergone at least 3 major phases of construction and decoration. The first phase, during the reign of Seti II, established the basic corridor plan of a queen's tomb. The second phase, during the Regency and then the independent reign of Tawosret, dramatically expanded the tomb, extending the corridors deeper into the hillside, adding new chambers, and commissioning royal decoration that reflected Tawosret's transformation from queen to pharaoh. The third phase, under Setnakhe, usurped the completed tomb, replastering sections of the walls, recarving the cartouches, and inserting Setnakhe's burial into the innermost chamber while relegating Tawosret's original burial, if it was ever actually placed there, to oblivion. The palimpsest quality of the tomb's walls is both technically fascinating and emotionally devastating. In places, 3 layers of text are visible: the original queen's inscriptions, the expanded pharaoh's inscriptions, and the usurper's overlay. The archaeologist must read not just the visible surface but the ghosts beneath it, the traces of earlier inscriptions that show through the later plaster, like a previous letter showing through an imperfectly erased sheet of paper. The process is painstaking. It requires raking light, angling a lamp across the wall surface at extremely low angles to reveal the faint impressions of earlier carvings that are invisible under direct illumination. It requires photography under specialized lighting conditions. It requires the patience to distinguish between a genuine earlier inscription and a natural irregularity in the stone. And it requires the willingness to accept that much of what was once written on these walls is now permanently lost, overcut too deeply, replastered too thickly, or simply worn away by the passage of 30 centuries. The work of reconstructing Tawosret's reign from these fragmentary sources has been carried out by a small community of dedicated scholars over the past several decades. Among the most important contributions has been the work of the French Egyptologist Pierre Grandet, who studied the administrative records of the late 19th dynasty and demonstrated the continuity of bureaucratic function during Tawosret's regency and reign. The American Egyptologist Catherine Roerig has published studies of Tawosret's iconographic program, the ways in which she was depicted in art, and how those depictions changed as her status evolved from queen to regent to pharaoh. And the British scholar Aidan Dodson has placed Tawosret's reign within the broader context of the end of the 19th dynasty, arguing that her seizure of power was a rational response to a succession crisis rather than an act of personal ambition. Dodson's work is particularly illuminating because it challenges the narrative that the 20th dynasty propagated, the narrative of Tawosret as usurper, as interloper, as a woman who disrupted the natural order. Dodson has argued that Tawosret's assumption of pharaonic authority was, in fact, the most logical solution to a political problem that had no other satisfactory answer. Siptah was dead. He had no heir. The legitimate Ramesside line, the direct descent from Ramesses II through Meremptah and Seti II, had effectively ended. In the absence of a clear male successor, the most senior member of the royal family was the great royal wife, Tawosret herself. Her claim to the throne was not based on usurpation. It was based on her position as the last surviving figure, with a plausible connection to the dynasty's legitimacy. She did not seize power. She was, in a sense, the only one left to hold it. But the problem, and this is the core of the tragedy, is that being right was not enough. Legitimacy in ancient Egypt was not merely a matter of genealogical logic or political necessity. It was a matter of cosmic order, and cosmic order, in Egyptian theology, required a male king. A female pharaoh was not merely unusual. She was, in the strictest theological sense, a contradiction, a violation of the fundamental principle that the throne of Horus could only be occupied by a male incarnation of the god. Tawosret could claim political legitimacy. She could not claim theological legitimacy. And in a civilization where politics and theology were inseparable, where the pharaoh was simultaneously head of state and living god, that distinction was fatal. The modern excavation of KV-14 has added further layers to this story. The University of Arizona Egyptian expedition, led by Richard Wilkinson, conducted extensive survey work in the Valley of the Kings that included detailed documentation of KV-14's current condition. The tomb has suffered significantly from flash floods over the centuries. The valley's drainage patterns channel rainwater directly into many of the tomb entrances, and substantial sections of the decoration have been damaged or destroyed by water infiltration. The tomb is not currently open to regular tourism, though it has been accessible to researchers and occasional visitors. Its condition represents yet another dimension of the erasure, not the deliberate erasure of political enemies, but the accidental erasure of time and water working on the same surfaces that the chisels of Setnehate's workmen once attacked. The question of Tawosret's burial adds another layer of mystery. Was she ever actually interred in KV-14? The tomb was clearly prepared for her burial. The sarcophagus chamber was carved. The walls were decorated with the underworld texts that were designed to guide the pharaoh's soul through the dangers of the night journey. But by the time Setnekai took possession of the tomb, Tawosret's burial equipment had been removed or destroyed. Her sarcophagus has not been found. Her canopic jars, the vessels that held the preserved organs of the deceased, have not been identified. Her mummy has never been recovered, or at least has never been identified among the collection of unidentified royal mummies that have been found in various caches and secondary burials throughout the Theban necropolis. There is a tantalizing possibility. Among the unidentified mummies discovered in the royal cache at KV-35, the tomb of Amenhotep II, where a collection of displaced royal mummies was hidden by ancient priests during the 21st dynasty to protect them from tomb robbers. There are several unidentified female bodies. One of these, designated Unknown Woman D, has been the subject of speculation as a possible candidate for Tawosret. The mummy shows evidence of being a woman of middle age at the time of death, which is broadly consistent with what we know of Tawosret's likely lifespan. But without definitive DNA evidence or other identifying markers, the attribution remains speculative. The mummy may be Tawosret, it may be another queen, it may be a member of the royal family whose name has been entirely lost. The uncertainty is a final cruel echo of the erasure. Even in death, Tawosret cannot be identified with certainty. The woman who ruled Egypt cannot be found. But the limestone of KV-14 remembers. Beneath the overcut cartouches of Setnakate, beneath the replastered walls and the recarved figures, the original outlines of Tawosret's tomb decoration can still be detected, faintly, fragmentarily, but unmistakably. The paint is gone, the gold is gone, the burial equipment is gone, but the incised lines that the Deir el Medina craftsman cut into the stone more than 3,000 years ago, the lines that define the shape of a woman wearing the double crown, making offerings to the gods as Pharaoh, those lines are still there, cut into stone, deeper than the chisel marks of the erasers, deeper than the plaster of the usurpers, waiting in the darkness of the tomb for someone to look closely enough to see them. And that is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Tawosret's story. She was erased, but she was not destroyed. The erasure failed, not immediately, not in her own time, but across the millennia. The stone preserved what the politics tried to erase. The fragments survived what the propaganda tried to bury. And the truth, patient, persistent, indifferent to the ambitions of kings, eventually surfaced. 3,000 years late, but it surfaced. Tawosret's story does not exist in isolation. She was the last in a series of women who navigated, exploited, and ultimately collided with the structures of Egyptian royal power. To understand the full weight of what happened to her, and what her erasure tells us about the civilization that produced her, we need to examine the broader pattern, the pattern of women who rose, who ruled, and who were punished for it. The first and most obvious comparison is Hatshepsut, and we have already touched on her story. But there are dimensions of the comparison that deserve deeper exploration, because the differences between Hatshepsut's experience and Tawosret's illuminate something fundamental about how power functioned in ancient Egypt. Hatshepsut took the throne during the early 18th dynasty, a period of extraordinary vitality and expansion. Egypt was wealthy, the military was strong, the trade networks were flourishing, the theological establishment at Karnak was confident and well-funded. Hatshepsut inherited a functioning state and used its resources to build one of the most magnificent reigns in Egyptian history. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari remains one of the architectural masterpieces of the ancient world. 3 broad terraces rising against the Theban cliffs, their colonnades decorated with scenes of the expedition to Punt, the obelisks erected at Karnak, and the divine birth narrative that legitimized her claim to the throne. The temple was not just a burial monument, it was a political statement carved into the landscape, visible for kilometers, impossible to ignore, declaring with every stone that a woman had built something worthy of eternity. The expedition to Punt deserves particular attention because it demonstrates the kind of ambitious state enterprise that a female pharaoh could undertake when she had the resources and the time to do so. Punt, the mysterious land of incense and exotic goods, located somewhere on the coast of the Red Sea, possibly in modern Eritrea, Somalia, or eastern Sudan, had been a trading destination for Egyptian expeditions since at least the 5th dynasty. But Hatshepsut's expedition was the most elaborately documented. The relief carvings at Deir el-Bahari show the ships, the crew, the goods exchanged, the tropical landscape of Punt with its stilt houses and strange flora, and the famous depiction of the Queen of Punt, a woman of considerable size whose image has fascinated and puzzled Egyptologists for generations. The expedition returned with incense trees, gold, ivory, ebony, and live animals, and the successful completion of the venture was presented as proof of divine favor, proof that Amun himself endorsed Hatshepsut's reign. Tawosret had no Punt expedition, she had no Deir el-Bahari, she had no 20 years of prosperous rule during which to weave her presence into the fabric of the state. The contrast between the 2 female pharaohs is not merely political, it is material. Hatshepsut's survival in the historical record, despite the erasure campaign that followed her death, is a direct consequence of the scale and quality of her building program. She built so much, so well, in so many places, that the erasers simply could not destroy it all. Some statues were buried but survived. Some reliefs were plastered over, but the originals endured beneath the plaster. Some inscriptions in remote locations were overlooked entirely. The redundancy of her monumental program was, in effect, a survival strategy, whether intentional or not. By placing her name and image in hundreds of locations across Egypt, Hatshepsut ensured that no single campaign of destruction could eliminate them all. Tawosret had no such redundancy. Her building program was limited: a few blocks at Karnak, a small temple in the Sinai, a mortuary temple that was completely dismantled, and a tomb that was usurped. When the erasers came for Tawosret, they found a small target, and they hit it almost perfectly. The second figure who demands comparison is Sebekneferu, the first confirmed female pharaoh in Egyptian history, and a figure even more obscure than Tawosret. Sebekneferu ruled at the very end of the 12th dynasty, roughly 1797 to 1793 BC, more than 600 years before Tawosret. She was the daughter of Amenemhat III, and possibly the sister or half-sister of Amenemhat IV, the last male pharaoh of the dynasty. When Amenemhat IV died, under circumstances that are, as usual, unclear, Sebekneferu took the throne. Her reign lasted approximately 4 years, and the evidence for it is extraordinarily sparse. A handful of statues, some of which show her wearing both male and female regalia simultaneously, the dress of a queen beneath the Nemes headdress and kilt of a pharaoh, a few inscriptions at Hawara and in the Fayum region, and then nothing. The 12th dynasty ended with her death, and the 13th dynasty that followed appears to have made no effort to continue her line. What makes Sobekneferu relevant to Tawosret's story is the pattern. Both women took the throne at the end of a dynasty. Both faced the problem of ruling without a male heir to continue the line. Both reigned briefly, and both were followed by a new dynasty that had no interest in preserving their legacy. The pattern suggests something structural. That female pharaonic rule in Egypt was not a random occurrence, but a recurring response to a specific political situation. The failure of the male succession line at the end of a dynasty. When the male heirs ran out, when the dynasty was already dying, when there was no man of sufficient legitimacy to claim the throne, then and only then was a woman permitted to step into the void. Female pharaonic rule was, in this reading, not a triumph of individual ambition, but a symptom of dynastic collapse, the last resort of a system that had exhausted every other option. The treatment of Sobekneferu after her death further reinforces the pattern. Unlike Tawosret, Sobekneferu was not subjected to a systematic erasure campaign. Her name appears in the Turin canon and in Manetho's king list, though in both cases the entries are brief and ambiguous, but she was also not celebrated. No later pharaoh claimed her as a predecessor or honoured her memory. Her statues were not maintained, her monuments were not restored. She was permitted to exist in the record, but only as a footnote, a transitional figure between the glories of the 12th dynasty and whatever came next. The treatment is different from Tawosret's active erasure, but the effect is similar. Both women were marginalised in the historical record. Both were treated as exceptions that proved the rule that Egypt was meant to be governed by male kings, who traced their lineage through an unbroken chain of father-to-son succession. The fact that the chain broke repeatedly, that multiple dynasties ended with the failure of the male line and the elevation of a woman to fill the gap, was something the Egyptian system preferred not to dwell on. The exceptions were tolerated in fact and denied in principle. The record was adjusted accordingly. The third comparison takes us outside Egypt entirely, to the Hittite world, where the concept of female political authority operated under very different rules. Puduhippa, the queen of Hattusili III, has already appeared in this series as a counterpoint to Nefertari, but her relevance to Tawosret's story runs deeper. Puduhippa was not merely a queen, she was a co-ruler. Her seal appeared alongside her husband's on official state documents, treaties, diplomatic correspondence, religious dedications. She conducted independent diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers, including Egypt. She managed her own religious establishment as a priestess of Ishtar, and she did all of this openly, publicly, without the need for theological contortions or the assumption of male identity. The Hittite system simply accepted that a queen could exercise royal authority alongside the king. The distinction between the Egyptian and Hittite models of female power is revealing. In Egypt, female authority had to be hidden within the structures of male kingship, disguised beneath the double crown, concealed behind the false beard, justified by invented divine birth narratives. In the Hittite world, female authority was openly acknowledged and institutionally supported. Puduhippa did not need to become king in order to rule. She ruled as queen and was remembered for it. The contrast highlights the uniqueness of the Egyptian predicament. It was not that ancient societies were incapable of accommodating female political authority. The Hittites demonstrated that such accommodation was possible. It was that the Egyptian theological system, the specific ideology of divine kingship that made the pharaoh the earthly incarnation of Horus, was uniquely resistant to female rule. The problem was not cultural in the broad sense. It was theological in the specific sense, and it was this theological specificity that made the erasure of Tawosret not merely possible but, from the perspective of the men who carried it out, necessary. A female pharaoh was not just a political anomaly, she was a cosmic error, a disruption of the divine order that had to be corrected retroactively by removing her from the record. The fourth comparison returns us to the 19th dynasty itself, and to a figure who has haunted the margins of this narrative since the beginning, The Chancellor Bey. Bey's story is, in many ways, as extraordinary as Tawosret's, a foreigner who rose to the highest non-royal office in the Egyptian state, a commoner who was granted a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a privilege that was supposed to be reserved for the royal family alone, a kingmaker who publicly claimed credit for placing a pharaoh on the throne. Bey's trajectory represents a different kind of transgression from Tawosret's, not the transgression of gender, but the transgression of class and ethnicity, and the punishment was, in its own way, equally severe. Bey was not merely removed from office, he was executed. The ostracon from Deir el-Medina that records his death uses language, the great enemy, that places Bey in the category of existential threats to the Egyptian state. He was not a failed official, he was an enemy of Mat, of the cosmic order that the pharaoh was sworn to maintain. The parallel between Bey's execution and Tawosret's erasure is instructive. Both were responses to the same underlying anxiety, the fear that the boundaries of the Egyptian social and cosmic order were being breached. A foreigner in the highest office of the state, a woman on the throne of the gods. Both represented departures from the norms and traditions that the system had maintained for centuries, departures that the system could tolerate temporarily, in moments of crisis, when no alternative was available, but could not accept permanently as legitimate precedents for the future. Both represented departures from the norm that the system could tolerate temporarily, but could not accept permanently. And both were punished not for what they did, but for what they were, for the categories they violated, the precedents they set, the implications they carried for the future of a system that depended on fixed roles and unchanging hierarchies. There is one more figure who belongs in this exploration, and she takes us forward in time, rather than backward, to the very end of pharaonic civilization. Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra, the queen who has become the most famous woman of the ancient world, ruled Egypt more than 1,000 years after Tawosret, but the comparison is illuminating, precisely because of the contrasts it reveals. Cleopatra was a Ptolemaic ruler, a descendant of the Macedonian Greek dynasty that had governed Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. She did not operate within the pharaonic theological framework that had constrained Tawosret. She ruled as a Hellenistic monarch, using the tools of Greek political culture, personal charisma, strategic alliances, military partnerships, to maintain her position. She allied herself with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony, using Roman military power as a counterweight to the internal threats that faced her regime. Cleopatra is remembered. She is arguably the most remembered woman from the ancient world. Her name is known to billions of people who have never heard of Hatshepsut or Sobekneferu or Tawosret. Her story has been told and retold in literature, drama, film, and art for more than 2,000 years, from Plutarch to Shakespeare to Hollywood. But the reasons for Cleopatra's survival in historical memory are worth examining, because they reveal something uncomfortable about the mechanisms of remembrance. Cleopatra is remembered largely because of her relationships with Roman men, because her story intersected with the stories of Caesar and Antony, because her defeat at Actium was a pivotal moment in Roman history, because her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the absorption of Egypt into the Roman Empire. She is remembered as a character in the Roman narrative, not as an independent Egyptian ruler. Her fame is, in a sense, derivative, borrowed from the men whose stories she entered, sustained by the literary traditions of a civilization that was not her own. Tawosret, by contrast, had no Roman poets to immortalize her. She had no Shakespeare to dramatize her life. She had no classical literary tradition to carry her name across the centuries. She had only stone, and the stone was taken from her. The difference between Cleopatra's fame and Tawosret's obscurity is not a difference in merit or in the historical significance of their reigns. It is a difference in the survival of their stories, in the accident of which narratives were preserved and which were destroyed, which civilizations kept records that lasted and which allowed their records to be rewritten by their successors. The math is striking when you lay these cases side by side. Of the handful of women who held pharaonic authority across 3,000 years of Egyptian history, Sobekneferu, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti perhaps briefly, Tawosret, and arguably one or two others whose cases are even more ambiguous. Not a single one was remembered by the Egyptian tradition on her own terms. Every one was either erased, marginalized, or remembered only as an anomaly, a temporary deviation from the male norm that the system moved quickly to correct. 3,000 years, dozens of dynasties, hundreds of pharaohs, and the total contribution of female rulers to the official Egyptian historical record is, for all practical purposes, zero. They were there, they ruled, and then they were unmade. This pattern is not unique to Egypt. It recurs across ancient civilizations with depressing regularity. The Assyrians had no female kings. The Babylonians did not allow women to hold supreme authority. The early Roman Republic defined political authority as an exclusively male prerogative. The exceptions, the Cleopatras, the Zenobias, the Boudikas, prove the rule precisely by being exceptional. They stand out because they are anomalies, not because they represent a norm. And in almost every case, their stories are told from the perspective of the male-dominated cultures that opposed, defeated, or absorbed them. Tawosret's story, buried beneath the chisel marks of men who found her existence intolerable, is the most extreme expression of this pattern in the Egyptian record. She did not merely fail to be remembered, she was actively unremembered, made to unexist, reduced from a pharaoh to a silence so deep that 3,000 years would pass before anyone even realized that there was something missing from the record. But the pattern of erasure extends beyond the question of gender. The late 19th dynasty and early 20th dynasty witnessed a broader campaign of historical revision that affected not only Tawosret, but the entire network of individuals and institutions associated with the period of instability that preceded Setnakai's rise. The erasure of Bey has already been discussed, but the treatment of Siptah is also revealing. Siptah's cartouches were altered during and after his reign. His original name, Rameses Siptah, was changed to Meremptah Siptah at some point during his rule, possibly reflecting a shift in political alliances, or an attempt to strengthen his connection to the legitimate Ramesside line. After his death, his monuments received mixed treatment. Some were maintained, others were neglected, and his place in the historical record became ambiguous. He was not erased as systematically as Tawosret, but he was not commemorated with the enthusiasm reserved for fully legitimate pharaohs either. The 20th dynasty treated the final years of the 19th as a collective embarrassment, a period to be glossed over rather than celebrated, minimized rather than studied, remembered only insofar as it justified the new dynasty's claim to have restored order from chaos. The physical archaeology of this transitional period continues to yield new evidence. In recent decades, excavations at various sites across Egypt and the Sinai have produced fragmentary inscriptions, seal impressions, and ceramic markers that help to refine the chronology of the late 19th dynasty. The mining site at Serabit el-Kadim in the Sinai, where turquoise was extracted for use in jewelry and temple decoration, has produced inscriptions bearing both Tawosret's and Siptah's cartouches, evidence that the mines continued to operate under their joint authority and that the state's economic activities were maintained even during the period of political instability. These inscriptions are significant, not because they tell us anything dramatic, but because they tell us something normal, that under Tawosret's governance, the ordinary functions of the Egyptian state continued. Workers went to the mines, turquoise was extracted, inscriptions were carved, the machinery of empire kept turning, even as the question of who was legitimately turning the handle remained unresolved. The mining inscriptions also raise an important methodological point about how we study figures like Tawosret. The monumental record, the temples, the tombs, the colossal statues, is the most visible form of ancient Egyptian evidence, but it is also the most vulnerable to deliberate destruction. Temples can be dismantled, tomb walls can be recarved, statues can be smashed or reused. But small objects, scarabs, seal impressions, ostraca, ceramic jar labels, are too numerous and too dispersed to be systematically destroyed. They survive in the archaeological record precisely because they were too insignificant to attract the attention of the erasers. The small objects are, paradoxically, the most reliable evidence for the existence and activities of erased rulers. They are the evidence slipped through the net, the fragments that were too small to catch and too numerous to chase. This principle has broader implications for how we understand the ancient world. The grand narrative of Egyptian history, the succession of dynasties, the rise and fall of great kings, the construction of magnificent monuments, is built primarily from the monumental record. But the monumental record is, as Tawosret's story demonstrates, profoundly unreliable. It is a record that has been edited, censored, and rewritten by every generation that contributed to it. The true history of ancient Egypt, the messy, complicated, ambiguous history of real events and real people, lives not in the temples but in the trash, in the broken pottery and discarded ostraca, in the administrative records and work logs, in the small objects that ancient bureaucrats and craftsmen created for practical purposes and then threw away. These humble artifacts are the raw material of historical truth, and they are the reason that Tawosret's story, despite the best efforts of her enemies, has not been entirely lost. The fifth and final comparison in this exploration takes us to the broader context of the Bronze Age collapse. The systemic crisis that destroyed the political order of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century BC, and that provides the backdrop against which Tawosret's brief reign must be understood. The Bronze Age collapse is one of the most studied and least understood catastrophes in ancient history. Within a period of roughly 50 years, from approximately 1200 to 1150 BC, virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean region either collapsed entirely or suffered devastating decline. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt for dominance of the Near East for centuries, was destroyed. Its capital, Hattusa, a city of more than 40,000 people fortified with massive stone walls and decorated with monumental sculpture, was burned and abandoned. The cause of the destruction is still debated. Some scholars point to external invasion, the Sea Peoples, or groups from the Balkans and Western Anatolia. Others emphasize internal factors: drought, famine, political fragmentation, the breakdown of the centralized palace economy that had sustained Hittite society. The truth is probably a combination of all of these, a cascade of reinforcing failures that overwhelmed the system's ability to cope. The Mycenaean palatial civilization in Greece suffered a similar fate. The great centers of Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes, the palaces that had administered the economic and military affairs of the Aegean region for centuries, were destroyed in a wave of destructions that swept across the Greek mainland between approximately 1200 and 1150 BC. The Linear B script, which the Mycenaean scribes had used to record economic transactions, disappeared. The centralized palace economy collapsed. Greece entered a period of depopulation and cultural simplification that would last for centuries, the so-called Dark Age that separates the Mycenaean world from the classical Greek civilization that would eventually emerge from its ruins. The cities of the Levantine coast suffered equally. Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the ancient world, a cosmopolitan center that had maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships with Egypt, the Hittites, and the Aegean, was destroyed around 1185 BC, roughly the same time that Tawosret was ruling Egypt. The last letter from the king of Ugarit, found among the ruins of the city, unbaked and unsent, pleads for help against an approaching enemy. The enemy ships are already here, the letter reads. According to scholars who have studied the text, they have set fire to my towns and have done great damage in the country. The letter was never sent. The help never came. The city was destroyed and never reoccupied. Tawosret stood at the edge of this catastrophe. Egypt was the only major Bronze Age civilization that survived the collapse. Battered, diminished, but still functioning as a centralized state. And it survived in large part because of the defensive victories won by Ramesses III, who repelled the Sea Peoples in a series of land and naval battles documented on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The very temple built with stones taken from Tawosret's dismantled monument. The irony is sharp. The man who destroyed Tawosret's temple used its stones to build the monument that recorded Egypt's survival of the Bronze Age collapse. Tawosret's erasure is, in this sense, built into the physical structure of Egypt's salvation. Her destruction was the raw material of her successor's triumph. The connection between Tawosret and the Bronze Age collapse raises a question that has occupied scholars for decades. Did the instability of the late 19th dynasty, the succession crises, the regency of a foreign chancellor, the brief reign of a female pharaoh, contribute to Egypt's vulnerability during this critical period? Or was Tawosret's seizure of power a rational response to a crisis that was already unfolding, an attempt to hold the state together at a moment when it was in danger of fragmenting entirely? The evidence supports the latter interpretation. The late 19th dynasty was not unstable because Tawosret was in charge. Tawosret was in charge because the dynasty was unstable. She was a symptom of the crisis, not its cause. And the men who came after her and blamed the crisis on her gender and on Bey's foreignness were engaging in scapegoating, the ancient political practice of attributing systemic failures to individual transgressors, of blaming the messenger for the message, of finding human villains for structural problems. The scapegoating was effective. It allowed Setnake and Rameses III to present themselves as restorers of order, as the divinely chosen saviors who had rescued Egypt from the chaos of female and foreign misrule. The narrative was politically useful. It was also historically dishonest. The chaos that preceded Setnake's reign was not caused by Tawosret. It was caused by the same forces that were destroying every other civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. Drought, migration, economic collapse, the breakdown of the international trade networks that had sustained the Bronze Age world for centuries. Tawosret did not create these problems. She inherited them, and she governed through them as best she could, with limited resources, limited time, and a theological system that considered her very existence on the throne to be a violation of divine order. The tragedy is not that Tawosret failed. Given the circumstances, failure was almost inevitable. No ruler, male or female, could have reversed the forces that were tearing the 19th dynasty apart. The tragedy is that she was blamed for the failure, that her brief, embattled reign was used as evidence of divine displeasure, as proof that the gods punished nations that allowed women to rule, as justification for her erasure from the historical record. The tragedy is that the lie worked, that for 3,000 years, the men who destroyed Tawosret's memory succeeded in making the world believe that the end of the 19th dynasty was a story of female overreach rather than systemic collapse, that the real causes of the crisis, the drought, the economic decline, the military overextension, the breakdown of the international order, were hidden behind a simpler, more satisfying narrative. A woman did it. A foreigner helped her, and God was angry. The archaeology of KV-14 itself tells a story that the political narrative cannot suppress. The tomb is located in the main wadi of the Valley of the Kings, positioned among the tombs of some of the most prestigious pharaohs in Egyptian history. Its location was not accidental. Tawosret, or whoever supervised the selection of the tomb site, chose a position that placed her burial in the company of the great Ramesside kings, a spatial claim to legitimacy that reinforced the textual and iconographic claims made on the tomb's walls. The entrance faces north, opening into a descending corridor that penetrates more than 100 meters into the limestone cliff. The first corridor leads to a series of chambers and pillared halls that represent the original queen's tomb, the burial that was planned for Tawosret as the great royal wife of Seti II. Beyond this, the tomb continues deeper into the rock, through additional corridors and chambers that were excavated during the expansion phase, when Tawosret, as regent and then as pharaoh, transformed her queen's tomb into a king's monument. The architectural plan of the expanded tomb follows the standard pattern established for New Kingdom royal tombs. A series of corridors and chambers arranged along a single axis, descending into the hillside in a roughly straight line. The walls were prepared for decoration using the same techniques employed in every royal tomb in the valley. The limestone was cut smooth, covered with a layer of plaster, and then painted with scenes from the underworld texts. The quality of the workmanship varies throughout the tomb, reflecting the different phases of construction and the different political circumstances under which each phase was carried out. The earliest sections, the Queen's Tomb, show careful, confident work consistent with the high standards of the Deir el-Medina craftsman. The later sections, the pharaonic expansion, show evidence of haste, as if the work was being pushed forward under time pressure, with less attention to the fine details of finish and proportion that characterize the best royal tombs. This sense of haste is itself a clue to Tawosret's mindset during the final years of her regency and her brief independent reign. She knew that time was short, she knew that her position was precarious, and she was pushing to complete her monument, to establish her presence in the Valley of the Kings as a permanent, physical fact that would be difficult to undo, before the political situation turned against her. The irony, of course, is that the monument was undone anyway. Setnakhe's workmen simply replastered the walls, recarved the texts, and reused the space for a different burial. The haste of Tawosret's expansion was matched by the efficiency of Setnakhet's usurpation. Both were acts of political urgency. Both were driven by the knowledge that time was limited and that the winner of the political struggle would be determined in part by who controlled the physical space of the tomb. The sarcophagus chamber of KV-14 contained, at the time of its modern examination, 2 stone sarcophagi, one belonging to Setnakhet and one that appears to have been originally prepared for Tawosret and then either reused or left in place during the usurpation. The larger sarcophagus, made of red granite, is inscribed with texts from the Book of Gates and the Book of Caverns, the underworld texts that were designed to guide the pharaoh through the dangers of the night journey and ensure rebirth at dawn. The texts on the sarcophagus show signs of alteration, places where original cartouches have been recut, where figures have been modified, where the gender of pronouns has been changed from feminine to masculine. These alterations are the most intimate evidence of the erasure. The sarcophagus was not merely a container for a body, it was a theological instrument, a device designed to facilitate the pharaoh's transformation from a dead king into a living god. By altering the texts on the sarcophagus, Setnakhet's workmen were not just claiming a physical object. They were hijacking a spiritual technology. They were redirecting the magical energy of the underworld texts from Tawosret's soul to Setnakhet's, stealing not just her tomb but her path to eternity. The Valley of the Kings itself has undergone significant changes since the days of Tawosret and Setnakhet. Flash floods, which occur rarely but with devastating force in the Theban wadis, have deposited layers of debris in many of the tomb entrances, creating natural barriers that both protected and concealed the burials within. The water damage inside many tombs, including KV-14, is extensive, with flood deposits visible on the lower portions of the walls and in the lower chambers. The combination of water damage, usurpation, and millennia of neglect has left KV-14 in a condition that makes detailed study challenging. Much of the original painted decoration has been lost, damaged by water, obscured by replastering, or simply eroded by the passage of time. What remains is fragmentary, requiring the kind of careful analysis under controlled lighting conditions that only a dedicated research team can provide. The question of Bey's tomb, KV-13, adds another dimension to the archaeological landscape of this period. Bey's tomb is smaller than those of the pharaohs, but its presence in the Valley of the Kings is itself extraordinary. The tomb was found largely empty, looted in antiquity, its original contents destroyed or dispersed. But its location, its architectural plan, and the surviving fragments of its decoration confirm that Bey was buried with honours that far exceeded his nominal status as a non-royal official. The juxtaposition of Bey's tomb with Tawosret's tomb, both located in the Valley of the Kings, both associated with the controversial final years of the 19th dynasty, create a physical record of the political arrangement that Setnakhet's propaganda tried to erase. The arrangement in which a foreign chancellor and a queen regent jointly governed Egypt, while a disabled boy sat on the throne. The tombs are evidence, and evidence, unlike propaganda, does not require belief. It simply exists. The modern study of Tawosret has been shaped by broader developments in Egyptological methodology and theory. The rise of gender studies in the humanities during the late 20th century brought new attention to the role of women in ancient Egyptian society, and Tawosret, along with Hatshepsut, Sobekneferu, and other female rulers, became the subject of renewed scholarly interest. Researchers began to question the assumptions that had shaped earlier interpretations of female pharaonic rule. Assumptions that had taken the 20th dynasty's propaganda at face value and treated Tawosret as an anomaly, an aberration, or a symptom of decline. The new scholarship asked different questions. Not, why did a woman seize the throne? A question that assumes illegitimacy, but how did the succession system function when the male line failed? A question that assumes rationality. The shift in framing was subtle but transformative. It allowed scholars to see Tawosret not as a usurper who disrupted the natural order, but as a political actor who responded to a genuine crisis in the only way the system allowed. The work continues. New technologies, digital imaging, multispectral photography, three-dimensional scanning are being applied to the walls of KV14 and other usurped monuments, revealing details of the original decoration that were invisible to earlier investigators. These technologies can detect traces of paint and incision that lie beneath the surface of the visible decoration, building a picture of the original tomb that is more complete, though still frustratingly fragmentary, than anything that was available to previous generations of scholars. The digital reconstruction of Tawosret's tomb is, in a sense, a reversal of the ancient erasure, a technological unerasing that uses light and mathematics to undo what chisels and plaster tried to make permanent. But some things cannot be unerased. The paintings that once covered the walls of KV14, the images of Tawosret making offerings to the gods, the scenes of her journey through the underworld, the representations of her divine transformation from mortal queen to eternal pharaoh, are, in most areas of the tomb, permanently lost. The replastering that covered them has in many cases bonded chemically with the original surface, making separation impossible without destroying both layers. The information that those paintings contained, the specific iconographic choices, the color palette, the artistic style, the theological details, is gone, and with it has gone a dimension of Tawosret's story that can never be recovered. The visual dimension, the way she chose to present herself to the gods, the way she imagined her own afterlife, the way she saw herself as Pharaoh. We have her name, we have fragments of her titles, we have the architectural shell of her tomb, but we have lost her face. 3,000 years of stone and paint and political violence have taken that from us, and no technology, however advanced, can bring it back. There is another female figure from the New Kingdom whose story intersects with Tawosret's in ways that illuminate the broader pattern of female power and its suppression. Nefertiti, the great royal wife of Akhenaten. Nefertiti's case is different from Tawosret's in almost every particular. She lived nearly 2 centuries earlier, during the Amarna Revolution, when Akhenaten attempted to replace the traditional Egyptian pantheon with the sole worship of the Aten, the sun disk. Nefertiti was not merely a queen during this revolution, she was by all available evidence a co-architect of it. She is depicted in the art of Amarna, making offerings to the Aten without her husband, a privilege that had never been granted to any queen before. Her image appears on the boundary stelae that defined the limits of Akhenaten's new capital city. She is shown in the traditionally male posture of smiting enemies, swinging a mace over the heads of defeated foreigners in a scene that was, in every other context, reserved exclusively for the pharaoh. Some scholars have argued that Nefertiti may have briefly co-ruled with Akhenaten toward the end of his reign, and a minority view holds that she may have even succeeded him under a different name, possibly ruling as the enigmatic Pharaoh Smenkhare or Neferneferuaten, whose brief reign fills the gap between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. The debate over Nefertiti's possible reign as pharaoh has been raging for decades and remains unresolved. But the relevance to Tawosret is clear regardless of how the debate is settled. Nefertiti, like Tawosret, pushed against the boundaries of what the Egyptian system allowed a woman to do, and Nefertiti, like Tawosret, was partially erased in the aftermath of her fall from power, not by a rival dynasty but by the restoration itself, the return to orthodox religion that characterized the reigns of Tutankhamun and Horemheb. The Amarna period was treated by later Egyptians as an aberration, a period of heresy and disorder that had to be corrected and, where possible, forgotten. Nefertiti's role in that aberration made her a target for the same kind of retrospective condemnation that would later be applied to Tawosret. Both women wielded extraordinary power. Both were associated with periods that later rulers wished to disown, and both paid the price of association, their memories sacrificed to the political needs of men who came after them. The mortuary temple of Tawosret deserves special attention because its destruction represents the most complete form of architectural erasure that ancient Egypt could practice. Unlike the tomb, whose walls could be replastered and recarved, but whose basic structure remained intact, the mortuary temple was dismantled entirely, its stones removed, transported, and incorporated into the construction of Ramesses III's massive temple complex at Medinet Habu. The process was systematic. The blocks were catalogued, selected for size and quality, and repositioned within the new structure. Some were turned so that their inscribed faces were hidden, placed inward against other blocks, with Tawosret's cartouches pressed against the darkness of the interior wall. Others were recut, their surfaces dressed down to remove the original inscriptions and prepared for new carving. The reuse of building stone was common in ancient Egypt. It was economically rational to quarry already cut blocks from an existing structure rather than extracting new stone from the quarries at Aswan or Gebel el Silsila, a process that required enormous labour, significant transportation costs, and months of work by skilled quarrymen. But the reuse of Tawosret's temple had a dimension that went beyond economics. It was symbolic. By consuming Tawosret's temple and incorporating its substance into his own monument, Ramesses III was not merely recycling stone. He was performing an act of architectural cannibalism, absorbing the material legacy of a predecessor he wished to obliterate, transforming her monument into the raw material of his own glory. Medinet Habu is, today, one of the best preserved temple complexes in Egypt. Its massive walls, decorated with scenes of Ramesses III's military victories against the Sea Peoples and the Libyans, are among the most important historical documents of the late New Kingdom. Tourists walk through its halls, study its reliefs, photograph its colossal statues, and very few of them know that built into the fabric of those walls are the dismembered remains of Tawosret's mortuary temple. The blocks are there. Tawosret's cartouches are there, turned inward, hidden, but present. The most visited temple on the west bank of Thebes is, in part, the tomb of the most erased pharaoh in Egyptian history. The irony is so perfect that it feels scripted, but it is not scripted. It is simply what happened when a civilization that valued permanence above almost everything else decided that one woman's permanence was unacceptable. Step back now from the names and the dates, from the cartouches and the ostraca, from the chisel marks and the king lists. Step back from the specific story of Tawosret and look at what her story reveals about the nature of historical memory itself. What does it mean to erase a person from history? The question sounds abstract. It is not. It is as concrete as a chisel striking limestone. As concrete as a workman standing in a corridor of KV14, lamp in one hand, copper tool in the other, carefully cutting away the hieroglyphs that spell out a woman's name and replacing them with the hieroglyphs that spell out a man's. The workman is not thinking about historical memory. He is not thinking about cosmic order or theological legitimacy. He is thinking about the task in front of him, the angle of the chisel, the grain of the stone, the need to cut deep enough to obliterate the old text, but not so deep that the new text cannot be carved cleanly over it. He is a craftsman. He has been ordered to do a job. He does it well. And when he is finished, he picks up his tools, climbs the corridor back to the surface, and walks home to the village of Deir el Medina, where his wife has prepared bread and beer, where his children are playing in the narrow street, where the evening light is turning the Theban cliffs the colour of honey. He does not think about the woman whose name he has just erased. She is not his concern. She was a pharaoh, and now she is not a pharaoh. The stone has been corrected. The record has been set right. The order that was broken has been restored. He sleeps well, and 3,000 years later, An archaeologist stands in the same corridor, holding a lamp at the same angle, and traces the faint outlines of the original text beneath the usurper's overlay. The ghost of the original carving is still there, barely visible, detectable only under raking light, but unmistakable to trained eyes. The woman's name is still in the stone, not on the surface, not where it was meant to be read, but deeper, in the impressions left by the original chisel strokes, in the shadows that the later carving could not entirely conceal. The erasure was thorough, it was not absolute, and in the gap between thorough and absolute, a life has been recovered. Let that sink in. The survival of Tawosret's name, in the stone of her usurped tomb, is a metaphor for something larger, for the way that truth persists despite deliberate efforts to suppress it. But it is also a literal fact. The stone is the medium, the stone is the record, the stone is the surface on which human ambition and human cruelty and human persistence all leave their marks, layered one on top of another, each generation's truth partially concealing and partially revealing the truths of the generations that came before. Reading the walls of KV-14 is like reading a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been scraped and rewritten multiple times, each layer of text bleeding through into the others, creating a composite document that is simultaneously the story of Tawosret, the story of Setnakai, and the story of the act of erasure itself. The deliberate destruction of Tawosret's memory raises questions that extend far beyond ancient Egypt. Every civilization has practiced some form of historical erasure. The Romans called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, and applied it to emperors, senators, and public figures whose reigns or actions were deemed unacceptable by their successors. The practice involved the removal of names from public inscriptions, the destruction of statues, the deletion of references from official records. The Soviet Union practiced a modern version, airbrushing disgraced officials out of photographs and removing their names from encyclopedias and history books. The impulse to control the past, to determine who is remembered and who is forgotten, which stories are told and which are silenced, is one of the most fundamental expressions of political power. History is not simply what happened. History is what the powerful choose to record. And the erasure of Tawosret reminds us that the record is never neutral, never complete, never free from the interests of those who created it. This is not science fiction. This is the actual mechanism by which the past reaches the present, filtered through the decisions of scribes, priests, kings, and archivists who selected which events were worth recording and which were not, which rulers deserved commemoration and which deserved oblivion. The idea that history is an objective record of what happened, that the past simply waits to be discovered, like an artifact buried in the sand, is a comforting illusion. The truth is that the past is constructed, assembled from fragments, interpreted through lenses, shaped by the priorities and prejudices of every generation that handles the material. The past we know is not the past that existed, it is the past that survived. And what survived was determined not by the importance of events, but by the politics of memory. Let that sink in. Tawosret's story forces us to confront this reality in its starkest form. Here was a pharaoh, a person who held the most powerful position in one of the most powerful civilizations in human history, who was nearly erased from the record, not by accident, not by the slow decay of time, by deliberate human action. And if a pharaoh can be erased, what chance does anyone else have? What chance does a farmer have, or a fisherman, or a weaver, or a midwife? What chance does any ordinary human life have of surviving in the historical record when even the most powerful life in the land can be systematically obliterated? The answer is almost none. The vast majority of all the human beings who have ever lived, the billions of people who were born, who loved, who suffered, who died across the tens of thousands of years of human existence, have left no trace whatsoever, no name, no image, no object, no inscription, nothing. They lived, they mattered to someone, and they vanished. The archaeological record preserves a thin slice of the ancient world. The monumental buildings, the prestigious burials, the durable artifacts made of stone and metal and fired clay. Everything made of organic materials, wood, leather, textile, papyrus, is gone, with rare exceptions where extraordinary conditions of preservation intervened. and even the durable materials survive only where they were not deliberately destroyed, accidentally damaged, or simply buried too deeply to be found. The weight of this realization, the sheer scale of what has been lost, is something that anyone who works with ancient material feels acutely. The Egyptologist who studies Tawosret knows that the evidence she is working with is not a random sample of the ancient past. It is a biased sample, biased towards stone, biased toward royalty, biased toward the interests of the 20th dynasty that rewrote the record. Every conclusion drawn from this evidence is provisional, conditional, subject to revision in light of new discoveries that may or may not come. The Egyptologist knows that the most important questions about Tawosret's reign, why she was erased, what she accomplished, how she governed, what she thought and felt and feared, may never be answered, because the evidence that could answer them was either never created or was deliberately destroyed. And yet the work continues. That is the other truth that Tawosret's story reveals, that the impulse to recover the past is as powerful as the impulse to suppress it. For every king who ordered an erasure, there has been an archaeologist who looked beneath the surface. For every chisel that cut away a name, there has been a raking light that revealed the ghost beneath. The struggle between erasure and recovery, between forgetting and remembering, between power and truth, is one of the oldest and most persistent struggles in human civilization. And the fact that Tawosret's name is known today, that a woman who was systematically erased from the record of her own civilization can be discussed, studied, mourned, and remembered 3,000 years later, suggests that the struggle is not hopeless. The erasers are powerful, but they are not all powerful. The stone remembers what the chisel tries to forget. The deeper truth of Tawosret's story is not about one woman. It is about the fragility of all human memory. It is about the fact that what we know about the past, what we think we know, what we teach our children, what we write in our textbooks and display in our museums, is not the past itself but a reconstruction of the past, assembled from the fragments that survive the twin forces of decay and destruction. The reconstruction is the best we have. It is also inevitably incomplete, and the incompleteness is not random. It is systematic, shaped by the interests, the anxieties, and the power structures of every civilization that has ever decided what is worth remembering and what can be safely forgotten. Consider what the deliberate destruction of Tawosret's memory means in practical terms for our understanding of late 19th dynasty Egypt. Without the monumental record of her reign, without the temple reliefs, the mortuary chapel, the undamaged tomb decoration, we cannot know how she presented herself as Pharaoh. We cannot know which gods she favored, which rituals she performed, which artistic traditions she continued or modified. We cannot know how she addressed the economic crisis, how she managed the military, how she handled the diplomatic relationships that connected Egypt to the wider world. All of this information existed, carved into stone, painted onto plaster, written on papyrus, and all of it was either destroyed or buried beneath the overlay of a successor who wanted the world to believe that Tawosret's reign had been nothing more than an interlude of chaos. The erasure did not merely remove Tawosret from the record, it removed an entire chapter of Egyptian history, a chapter that might have contained solutions, innovations, and insights that we will never know about because the evidence was deliberately destroyed. The parallel to modern information fragility is impossible to ignore. We live in an age that produces more information than any previous era, and stores it in formats that are, by historical standards, extraordinarily fragile. Tawosret's inscriptions were carved into limestone, a medium that can survive for millennia under favourable conditions. Our records are stored on magnetic disks, solid-state drives, and remote servers, media that have lifespans measured in years, not centuries. A deliberate erasure of digital records would be far easier and far more complete than the erasure of Tawosret. A pharaoh's name carved into stone can survive 3,000 years of chiseling. A digital file can be deleted in a fraction of a second, permanently, with no ghost beneath the surface to reveal what was lost. The thought is sobering. If a civilization as sophisticated as ancient Egypt, a civilization that carved its records into stone specifically to ensure their permanence, could not prevent the deliberate destruction of a pharaoh's memory, What chance do our own records have? We comfort ourselves with the assumption that our information systems are backed up, replicated, distributed across multiple servers and multiple locations. But those systems depend on electrical power, on functioning hardware, on the continued operation of the institutions that maintain them. Remove any of these supports, through war, through economic collapse, through environmental catastrophe, and the digital record becomes as vulnerable as papyrus. More vulnerable, in fact, because papyrus at least has the advantage of being a physical object that can survive in a dry environment without any external support. A hard drive without electricity is a brick. A server without maintenance is scrap metal. A cloud without infrastructure is nothing at all. Imagine, for a moment, that a future civilization were to discover the ruins of our world 1,000 years from now. What would they find? The steel and glass of our buildings would have corroded and collapsed. The concrete would have crumbled. The asphalt would have cracked and been reclaimed by vegetation. The books, the physical, printed books that sit on shelves in libraries and homes, would have survived in varying degrees depending on the paper quality and storage conditions. But the vast majority of what we know, what we record, what we consider important, our scientific research, our legal documents, our personal correspondence, our art, our music, our photographs, exists only in digital form. And digital form, without the infrastructure to read it, is meaningless. A future archaeologist finding a hard drive in the ruins of a city would have no more ability to read its contents than a 19th century explorer had to read the hieroglyphs on Tawosret's tomb before Champollion cracked the code. The data would be there, encoded in the magnetic patterns on the disk, but the key to reading it would be lost. The Egyptians understood something about permanence that we have forgotten. They knew that stone lasts. They knew that paint, applied to prepared plaster in a dry environment, can survive for millennia. They knew that the physical medium of a message matters as much as the message itself. And they carved their most important texts, their religious liturgies, their royal genealogies, their monuments to the dead, into the hardest stone they could find, in the driest locations they could choose, in the deepest chambers they could excavate. The entire apparatus of Egyptian monumental culture was, at its core, a technology of permanence, a systematic effort to ensure that the most important information would survive the passage of time. And yet even that technology failed when the enemy was not time but politics. Even stone cannot survive a determined chisel. Even the most carefully carved inscription can be overcut, replastered, and recarved by a workman who has been ordered to make the past say something different from what it originally said. The technology of permanence was defeated by the technology of erasure, not because stone is fragile, but because political will is stronger than stone. The man with the chisel was more powerful than the woman whose name he was erasing, because the man with the chisel had the backing of a new king, and the woman whose name he was erasing was dead. This is the final insight that Tawosret's story offers. Permanence is not a property of materials, it is a property of power. Stone lasts only as long as no one with sufficient authority wants it changed. Inscriptions endure only as long as no one with the means to alter them decides that they should say something else. The past is not fixed. It is negotiated, contested between those who want to preserve it and those who want to rewrite it. And the outcome of that contest depends not on the durability of the medium, but on the balance of power between the preservers and the erasers. There is a phrase in Egyptian that captures something essential about this dynamic. The concept of Ma'at, the cosmic order, the principle of truth, justice, and harmony that was the foundation of all Egyptian civilization, was understood not as a state of nature, but as a condition that had to be actively maintained. Ma'at did not simply exist. It had to be created, renewed, defended against the forces of chaos, Isfet, that were constantly pressing against the boundaries of the ordered world. The pharaoh's primary duty was the maintenance of Ma'at, and this duty extended to the maintenance of the historical record. To be a pharaoh was to be a guardian of truth, to alter the historical record, to erase a predecessor, to rewrite a cartouche, to replaster a tomb, was by the logic of Ma'at an act of cosmic significance. It was not merely a political act. It was a theological one. The eraser was claiming that the original inscription was a violation of Ma'at, and that the correction was a restoration of truth. Setnakti's erasure of Tawosret was, in his own terms, an act of Ma'at maintenance. He was not destroying a legitimate pharaoh's memory. He was correcting a cosmic error, removing from the record a figure whose existence on the throne had been, in his theological understanding, a violation of the divine order. The woman had been a disruption. The erasure was the cure. And by this logic, the logic of Ma'at, the logic of cosmic order, the logic that placed the proper succession of male pharaohs at the center of the universe, Setnakte was not doing something wrong. He was doing something necessary. He was healing the world. The cruelty of the logic is breathtaking, and the fact that it was sincerely believed, that the men who chiseled Tawosret's name from the walls of her tomb genuinely believed that they were restoring cosmic order rather than committing an act of political violence, makes it worse, not better. It is easy to condemn cruelty that knows itself to be cruel. It is harder to condemn cruelty that believes itself to be righteous. And the erasure of Tawosret was righteous cruelty, carried out in the name of truth, in the service of order, in obedience to a theological system that could not accommodate a woman on the throne of Horus. The erasers were not villains by their own standards. They were guardians. They were protectors of the cosmic balance. And the woman whose name they erased was, in their understanding, not a victim but a transgressor, a person who had disrupted the divine order and whose removal from the record was a necessary correction. And yet, standing in the corridors of KV-14, looking at the places where the chisel struck, it is impossible not to feel grief. Not anger. Grief is the right word. Grief for the woman who governed an empire in crisis and was punished for it. Grief for the paintings that were destroyed, the images that were replaced, the face that was erased. Grief for the loss of a story that might have been told differently, that might have been told at all, if the men who came after had been willing to allow a woman's reign to stand in the record on its own terms. The grief is not for Tawosret alone. It is for all the stories that were never told because the tellers were silenced, all the names that were never spoken because the speakers were forbidden, all the lives that were lived fully and meaningfully and then unmade by the simple, devastating exercise of political power over historical memory. There is a moment in the study of Tawosret's reign when the investigation stops being scholarly and becomes something more personal. It is the moment when you realize that the fragments you are studying, the damaged cartouches, the ghostly inscriptions, the overcut figures barely visible under raking light, are not merely data. They are evidence of a person's attempt to exist, to be remembered, to leave a mark on the world that would outlast the brief years she was given. And the damage to those fragments is not merely deterioration, it is violence. The work of human hands, directed by human will, against a human being's hope of permanence. This is what makes Tawosret's story so difficult to sit with. It is not a story of simple good versus evil. It is a story of systems, of the way that institutions, once established, develop internal logics that can be used to justify the destruction of the very people they were designed to serve. The Egyptian system of divine kingship was, in many ways, one of the most magnificent institutional achievements in human history. It sustained a civilization for 3,000 years. It produced art, architecture, literature, and theology of extraordinary sophistication. It created a framework for governance that allowed millions of people to live in relative order and prosperity for millennia. And it could not tolerate a woman on the throne. The same system that built the pyramids and carved the temples and painted the tombs also produced the chisel that erased Tawosret's name. The greatness and the cruelty came from the same source. They were inseparable. Tawosret was not safely forgotten. She was unsafely forgotten, erased with effort, with intention, with political purpose. And the fact that her erasure failed, that her name survived in the depths of the stone, in the fragments of scarabs scattered across the desert, in the bureaucratic records of a village of craftsmen who simply wrote down what happened and filed it away, is perhaps the most hopeful thing about her story. Not hopeful in the triumphant sense, not hopeful in the way of stories that end with justice or vindication. Hopeful in the quieter sense, the sense in which a single recovered name, a single reconstructed life, represents a small but real victory against the darkness that swallows everything. Stand at the entrance to KV-14, not inside, just at the threshold, where the daylight of the Theban Wadi meets the darkness of the corridor. The limestone is pale, almost white in the midday sun. The entrance is modest, a rectangular opening in the cliff face, unremarkable among the dozens of tomb entrances that dot the valley walls. There is no colossal statue guarding the door, no carved facade announcing the name of the occupant. The tomb does not declare itself the way the tombs of Ramesses II or Seti I declare themselves. It is quiet, almost self-effacing, as if the tomb itself understood that drawing attention was dangerous. And perhaps it was. Perhaps the modesty of the entrance is itself a clue, a sign that Tawosret, or the officials who supervised her burial, understood that a tomb too obviously associated with a female pharaoh would be a target, that a grand entrance, a colossal statue, a conspicuous display of royal prerogative would invite exactly the kind of usurpation that eventually occurred. The restraint may have been strategic, or it may simply have reflected the limited resources available at the end of a dying dynasty. Either way, the entrance to KV-14 is a doorway into something larger than a single burial. It is a doorway into the question of how civilizations remember and how they forget, and what the difference between the two tells us about who we are. The story of Tawosret raises questions that extend far beyond ancient Egypt and far beyond the specific circumstances of the late 19th dynasty. It raises questions about the relationship between power and memory, between legitimacy and survival, between truth and the narratives that civilizations construct to justify their existence. Every civilization has its official version of its own past, a version that emphasizes certain events, certain figures, certain values, while minimizing or erasing others. The official version is not necessarily false, but it is never complete. And the gaps in the official version, the silences, the omissions, the places where the chisel has struck, are often more revealing than the version itself. What does it mean for our own civilization that we are only now recovering the names of women who ruled 3,000 years ago? What does it mean that the historical record, as it was transmitted through the centuries, through Manetho, through the classical historians, through the medieval Arabic scholars who studied the ruins of Egypt, contained almost no trace of Tawosret, Sobekneferu, or the other women who held pharaonic power? It means that the record was not neutral. It was curated, not by a single act of censorship, but by the accumulated weight of centuries of assumptions. Assumptions about who was worth remembering, whose stories were worth telling, whose names were worth preserving. The erasure of Tawosret was an extreme case, a deliberate, politically motivated destruction of a specific individual's memory. But the broader marginalization of women's roles in the historical record was not extreme. It was normal. It was the default. It was the way that history was written for most of its existence, by men, for men, about men, and the exceptions prove the rule precisely by being exceptions. The modern recovery of Tawosret's story, through patient archaeological work, through careful analysis of fragmentary evidence, through the willingness of scholars to question the received narrative and look beneath the surface for the truths that the surface was designed to conceal, is one of the quiet triumphs of the humanities. It demonstrates that the past is not fixed, that official versions can be challenged, that silences can be interrogated, that even the most thorough erasure can be partially undone by the application of intelligence, patience, and the right questions. But the recovery is also a reminder of how much has been permanently lost. For every Tawosret whose name has been recovered from the stone, there are thousands of women, queens, priestesses, scribes, artists, healers, mothers, whose names were never carved in stone in the first place. Women who lived rich, complex, consequential lives and left no trace in the archaeological record because the materials on which their stories were recorded, papyrus, cloth, oral tradition, did not survive. Women who contributed to the functioning of Egyptian civilization in ways that were essential but invisible, managing households, raising children, producing textiles, preparing food, maintaining the social fabric, that made monumental construction and military campaigns possible. These women are not merely forgotten, they are unknowable. The evidence that could tell their stories was never durable enough to survive, and their absence from the record is not evidence of their unimportance. It is evidence of the bias of the record itself. A record that was designed to preserve the names and deeds of kings, not the lives of the people who made those deeds possible. The implications for our own time are uncomfortable. We like to believe that we are different, that our civilization values all lives equally, that our records are comprehensive, that our technologies of preservation are superior to anything the ancient world could produce. And in some respects, this is true. The digital age has given more people the ability to record and share their stories than any previous era. Social media, personal websites, digital photography, email, the tools of modern self-documentation are available to billions of people in a way that the tools of ancient inscription were available to a tiny elite. And it gets stranger when you consider the paradox. The more we record, the less likely any individual record is to survive. The sheer volume of digital information being produced today, estimated at more than 2.5 quintillion bytes per day, according to some recent analyses, means that the signal-to-noise ratio is approaching zero. In a world where everyone is recording everything, nothing stands out, nothing demands preservation. The archive becomes so vast that it becomes, for practical purposes, unsearchable, a sea of data in which individual lives are drops of water, indistinguishable from the billions of other drops that surround them. The ancient Egyptians preserved too little and thereby created an incomplete record. We are preserving too much and thereby creating an incomprehensible one. The result, in both cases, is the same: the loss of individual stories beneath the weight of the system that was proposed to preserve them. Tawosret's tomb is crumbling. The walls of KV-14, already damaged by millennia of flash floods, salt crystallization, and political vandalism, continue to deteriorate. The fragments of original decoration that survive beneath the Setnakte overlay are becoming harder to read as the stone itself weathers and the chemical processes that have been slowly breaking down the plaster since the day it was applied continue their patient work. Each year, the window through which Tawosret's story can be studied narrows a little further. Each decade, a few more fragments are lost. The tomb is not merely a monument to a forgotten pharaoh. It is a clock counting down, grain by grain, toward the day when the last legible trace of the original decoration finally disappears, and Tawosret's erasure, which failed 3,000 years ago, is finally completed by the indifference of chemistry and time. And here is where the reflection must become personal, not about Tawosret but about us, about the choices we make regarding what we preserve, what we fund, what we study, what we care about. The survival of Tawosret's story depends on the continued investment of resources, financial, intellectual, technological, in the study and preservation of her tomb and the other fragments of evidence that document her reign. That investment is not guaranteed. Archaeological funding is always precarious. Academic positions in Egyptology are limited. The political and economic circumstances that make international research collaborations possible are subject to the same kinds of disruption that destroyed the Bronze Age world 3,000 years ago. The recovery of Tawosret's story is not a finished project. It is an ongoing effort, as fragile in its way as the stone on which her name was carved. The question of what we owe the past is not an abstract philosophical exercise. It is a practical question with practical consequences. Every year, decisions are made about which archaeological sites receive funding, which tombs are opened for conservation work, which research proposals are approved, which graduate students are trained in the skills necessary to study the ancient world. These decisions determine what we will know about the past in 10 years, in 50 years, in a century. They determine which stories will be recovered and which will be lost, and they are made, inevitably, on the basis of priorities that reflect the values and limitations of the present, not the needs of the past. Tawosret's tomb is not a priority site for conservation. It is not as visually spectacular as the tomb of Nefertari, whose restored paintings draw thousands of visitors each year. It is not as famous as the tomb of Tutankhamun, whose discovery in 1922 made it the most celebrated archaeological find in history. It is not as well preserved as the tomb of Seti I, whose exquisite relief carvings are among the finest in the Valley of the Kings. KV-14 is a damaged, usurped, partially flooded tomb whose original decoration is largely lost, and whose significance lies not in what can be seen on the surface, but in what can be detected beneath it. It is a tomb that rewards the specialist, not the tourist. It is a tomb that tells its story in whispers, not in shouts. And yet it is precisely these quiet, difficult, unglamorous sites that often hold the most important historical truths. The grand tombs tell us what the powerful wanted us to know, the official version, the propaganda, the curated narrative of divine kingship and military triumph. The damaged, usurped, overwritten tombs tell us what the powerful wanted us to forget. The contested successions, the female rulers, the foreign chancellors, the uncomfortable truths that did not fit the official story. KV-14 is, in this sense, one of the most important tombs in the Valley of the Kings, not despite its damage but because of it. The damage is the story. The usurpation is the evidence. The erasure is the proof that something worth erasing once existed there. The responsibility does not belong to Egyptologists alone. It belongs to everyone who benefits from the knowledge that the humanities produce. Knowledge about who we are, where we came from, what our species has been capable of across the span of its existence. The recovery of Tawosret's story is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of justice, a small, belated, partial act of justice against the erasure that was committed 3,000 years ago. And acts of justice, however small and however late, matter. They matter because they affirm a principle that is worth affirming. The principle that every human life deserves to be remembered, that every story deserves to be told, that the deliberate destruction of memory is a crime against the future as much as against the past. The tomb is still there, the stone is still there, the ghost of Tawosret's name is still visible. If you hold the lamp at the right angle, if you know where to look, if you have the patience and the training to read what the darkness is trying to tell you. The question is whether we will continue to look, whether we will continue to fund the research, train the scholars, maintain the sites, and do the slow, unglamorous, essential work of recovering the stories that power tried to bury. The answer to that question will determine not only what we know about Tawosret, but what we know about ourselves, about our willingness to hear the voices that the powerful tried to silence, about our capacity to look beneath the surface of the official record and find the truths that were hidden there all along. There is a tomb in the Valley of the Kings that tells two stories at once. On the surface, it is the tomb of Setnache, founder of the 20th dynasty, the man who claimed to have restored order to a land corrupted by foreign influence and female overreach. His cartouches are visible on the walls. His burial was placed in the innermost chamber. His name is the one that appears in the guidebooks and on the plaques that identify the tomb for the occasional visitor who makes it this far into the valley. But beneath the surface, beneath the replastered walls, beneath the recarved cartouches, beneath the layer of paint that was applied over the original decoration, another story persists. The story of a woman who was great royal wife, then regent, then pharaoh. A woman who had governed Egypt during one of the most dangerous periods in its 3,000-year history. A woman whose name was chiseled from the walls of her own tomb by the men who took her throne, and who tried, with all the resources of the Egyptian state at their disposal, to make the world believe that she had never existed. Her name was Tawosret, and she existed. That simple statement, she existed, carries a weight that is difficult to convey in words. To say that Tawosret existed is not merely to affirm a historical fact. It is to push back against 3,000 years of deliberate suppression. It is to say that the 20th dynasty's propaganda was a lie, that the chaos they described was not caused by a woman on the throne, but by systemic forces that no individual ruler, male or female, could have controlled. It is to say that the erasure failed, that the chisels were not sharp enough, that the plaster was not thick enough, that the truth, carved into limestone by craftsmen who were simply doing their job, outlasted the ambitions of the men who tried to bury it. Think about those craftsmen for a moment. The men of Deir el-Medina who carved the original inscriptions in KV-14, who spelled out Tawosret's name and titles in careful hieroglyphs, who painted her image on the prepared plaster, who rendered the scenes of her divine journey through the underworld with the same skill and dedication they brought to every royal tomb they worked on. They did not know that their work would be overwritten within a generation. They did not know that the name they were carving would be chiseled away by their own successors, their own sons and grandsons perhaps, working for a new king who demanded that the old queen be unmade. They carved the name because that was their job. They carved it well because that was their standard, and the quality of their work, the depth of their incisions, the confidence of their line, the precision of their craftsmanship, is the reason that the name survived the erasure. If they had carved more shallowly, more carelessly, the later chisel marks would have obliterated the original text entirely. But they carved deeply, they carved honestly, and the depth of their honesty defeated the depth of the erasure. There is something profoundly moving about this. The survival of Tawosret's name in the stone of her tomb is not a consequence of political power, or military strength, or theological authority. It is a consequence of good craftsmanship, of a workman who took pride in his work and cut his letters deep. The most enduring legacy of Tawosret's reign may be not anything she did as pharaoh, but the quality of the work that was done in her name by anonymous men who walked over a mountain each morning to carve and paint in a corridor beneath the Theban hills. The craftsman outlasted the king. The chisel outlasted the crown. The hand that carved the name 3,000 years ago reached across the centuries and touched the hand of the archaeologist who rediscovered it. Two strangers, separated by an ocean of time, connected by the simple, stubborn fact of a name cut into stone. By the end of tonight, the answer to the question implied by this documentary's title should be clear. Was Tawosret truly the last female pharaoh of the 19th dynasty? Yes, she was the last and the most thoroughly erased. She ruled at the intersection of every force that could destroy a legacy: political hostility, theological incompatibility, dynastic collapse, economic crisis, and the deliberate campaign of a successor who needed her to be illegitimate in order for his own claim to be legitimate. She faced more obstacles than any other female ruler in Egyptian history. She had less time, fewer resources, and more enemies than Hatshepsut. She had less international fame than Cleopatra. She had less monumental visibility than Sebekneferu. And yet she governed, she ruled, she held the crook and the flail, she wore the double crown, and when her enemies came for her memory, the stone held just enough of her name to make recovery possible. The pattern that Tawosret's story reveals. The pattern of women who rise to power at the end of failing dynasties, who are tolerated in life and punished in death, who are permitted to rule but not permitted to be remembered, is not unique to ancient Egypt. It is a pattern that recurs across civilizations and centuries, wherever political systems are structured around male authority, and wherever the historical record is controlled by the successors rather than the subjects of power. The pattern is not inevitable, but it is persistent, and recognizing it, seeing it clearly, naming it honestly, refusing to accept the propaganda of the erasers as the final word, is the first step toward breaking it. There is something quiet and powerful about the fact that Tawosret's name is spoken now, not in a temple, not in a palace, not in the presence of gods or kings, but in the modest, democratic, ordinary space of a documentary listened to by people who will never visit the Valley of the Kings, who will never descend the corridor of KV-14, who will never see the raking light reveal the ghost of a cartouche beneath the plaster. The name is spoken, that is enough. Not forever. Nothing is forever, as Tawosret's story demonstrates with devastating clarity, but for now, for this moment, the name survives. Tawosret, Sitra Meriamun, daughter of Ra, beloved of Amun, the last female pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, erased for 3,000 years, recovered by patience, by scholarship, by the stubborn refusal of stone to forget what human hands have tried to unmake. The Valley of the Kings is quiet tonight. The tourists have gone. The guards sit in their small shelters, waiting for the shift to end. The limestone cliffs glow faintly in the last light of the Egyptian sun. The same sun that Tawosret watched set over these same hills, more than 3,000 years ago, on evenings when the weight of the double crown pressed down on a head that carried the burden of an empire in crisis. She is not there, Her body has not been found, her face has not survived, her paintings are gone, overwritten by the man who took her tomb and claimed it as his own. But her name is in the stone, deeper than the chisel, deeper than the plaster, deeper than the politics that tried to kill her twice, once in body and once in memory. The name is there, and as long as there are people willing to hold a lamp at the right angle, to look beneath the surface, to ask the questions that the powerful would prefer not to be asked, the name will be read. The silence that was imposed on Tawosret has been broken, not by force, not by power, by attention, by care, by the simple radical act of looking at what was there all along and speaking it aloud. There is a lesson in this for anyone willing to hear it. The past does not speak for itself. It speaks through us, through the people who choose to study it, to fund it, to preserve it, to share it. Without that choice, the past falls silent. With it, the past can be heard across any distance, any silence, any erasure. The men who tried to destroy Tawosret's memory had armies and temples and the full authority of the Egyptian state behind them. The people who recovered her memory had patience, lamplight, and questions. And the questions won. They always win, eventually, not because truth is stronger than power, but because power is temporary and truth is patient. The chisels stop. The questions do not. The sun sets over the Valley of the Kings. The shadows fill the wadi like dark water rising. Somewhere beneath the stone, in a corridor that stretches 100 meters into the heart of the Theban hills, the outline of a woman wearing the double crown waits in the darkness. Patient, persistent, still there.